Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Coco Briseño with the California Department of Transportation Headquarters Planning and Modal Programs. So welcome to this quarter's California Freight Advisory Committee, also lovingly known as CFAC meeting. It's a little bit after 9 a.m., so I'm going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. First of all, I'd like to start out by thanking the Caltrans technical support staff who really make these CFAC meetings possible. They do a lot of the logistics behind the scenes, and then they really help with the webcasting to make sure that folks who cannot attend in person get to participate remotely. So thank you to them, and then thank you to everyone who has traveled from far away or even nearby to attend today. So we've tried to work diligently in the preparation for hosting and accommodating the CFAC meeting here at the District 7 office. So thank you to District 7 for hosting us. Let me cover a couple of housekeeping items, and then we're going to jump right into our agenda, because it is awfully lonely up here all by myself. I feel like what, did I not shower today or something? All right, but let me cover the housekeeping items. So if you haven't already done so, please make sure to sign in at the sign-in sheet over at the registration desk immediately outside. It really helps us keep track of who attends CFAC meetings, and then we can monitor to see what the trends are and who we might need to reach out to make sure that we're getting broad representation at CFAC. For CFAC members or alternate members, you should have received your packet when checking in at the registration desk. In your materials, there's a copy of the agenda along with your name tent, and most of you look like you have found it and you've put them to use. So if you are a CFAC member or an alternate member and you don't have a name tent or a packet, please be sure to visit the desk outside and you'll definitely get one. For those of you attending today as non-official CFAC members or guests, please make sure to take an agenda found at the front registration desk if you haven't already done so. And when you'd like to be called upon, as is the tradition with CFAC, at any point in the meeting, is just turn your tent over like this on its end, and then one of our staffs will bring you a microphone. We were unable to get microphones for all of the tables for this particular meeting, and because we do webcasts and we want to make sure that everybody can hear the question and the comment, the microphones will come around to everyone, so just be patient with us. Please remember to quiet your cell phones as a courtesy, and we'll do our best to call on you in the order that the name tents pop up, so try to keep track of all of that. For those of you attending the webcast, you can send your comments or your questions to cfac@dot.ca.gov. We may not be able to answer your question during the actual meeting, but we will definitely follow up after the meeting. CFAC meetings are open to the public and are subject to Bagley-Keene Act. So as chair, I'll take questions and comments, and then for members of the public, let Caltrans staff know during any of the question and answer session agenda item at the end of the day if you would like to make any comments. At that time, we'll make sure that you either come up to the table or you use one of the portable microphones to make sure that you're heard. In terms of the agenda, we have a couple of minor changes to the agenda. One of them is the web address, the website address. The link has been changed to our new ADA compliant website. So be patient with us because we're in this transition and still going through development. So some of the information that you used to find on the CFAC website is still being converted into ADA accessible formats. So we're getting to that point of having that information available. And if you need any information, it's always available. You can always just email cfac@dot.ca.gov to ensure that you receive whatever it is that you're looking for from CFAC. The other change is our guest presenter for agenda item number 10 from the California Transportation Commission. Garth Hopkins couldn't make it to today's meeting, but in his place is Anna Alubacher. Did I say that correctly? Close enough. She's like, close enough. We just know her as Anna, so. And our first guest speaker and host, John Belinsky, will kickstart our meeting this morning. So let me go ahead and introduce John. Many of you know John. So he's the Caltrans District 7 Director, our host here, which encompasses the metropolitan Los Angeles and Ventura counties. And he oversees transportation systems in a very dynamic region that boasts 25% of California's population. And John's been with the department for several years. 30 years. And so we really appreciate his service to Caltrans and to the state of California. So with that, I will introduce John and welcome him. And thank you again for hosting us here, John.
So, I'm not going to sit up there. That's weird.
I know.
Can I just use this? Is that okay?
It's very awkward to be up here all by
This doesn't work. Okay, well, welcome to District 7. How many of you have been in this building before? So do you know anything about the building? Probably not. So I'm just going to talk briefly about the building itself for a few minutes, and then I'll talk about what I really want to talk about, which is freight. We got seats up here, sir? So it's probably relatively easy to find the address on this building. If you walk by it, you can see the 100. This building was dedicated in 2004. It has also a glowing light bar, which is just below the numbers. And where do I go to change slides? Okay, go to the next one. Okay. Did you pass one? Okay, that's the second one. The south facade of the building is entirely surfaced with photovoltaic cells, which extend from the 4th floor to the 13th floor, so pretty extensive. It generates approximately 5% of the building's energy, while also shielding the facade from the sunlight, which reduces the demand for air conditioning. This building received a silver LEED rating in both 2006 and 2017. So a couple of the architectural or the aesthetic features, through generous support from Eli and Edith Broad, our lobby and plaza area in the building has a 4-story light installation by artist Keith Saunier titled Motordom. It provides shifting patterns of red and blue light generated by neon and argon tubes in horizontal bands around the lobby. So it's obviously during the day you're not going to see that, but it is pretty spectacular at night. Okay, so what I really want to talk about is projects in District 7 that are helping facilitate movement of goods. And we have a number of them. I just want to highlight a couple of them because I only have a few minutes, and I want to make sure that you guys stay on schedule. But the I-5 corridor improvement projects, we have 2 phases of those, north and south. Gerald Disman Bridge project. How many of you went on the port tour yesterday? So a few of you didn't get to see directly the Gerald Desmond, so I'll show you some pictures of that. And then I will talk about LA Metro's 28 by 20. So the first, and I apologize, this probably can't really read this all that well. But this is the I-5, one of the I-5 projects. And this is the I-5 North, so a significant number of work to make improvements along that corridor. The primary focus is HOV lanes, and you may ask, how does that contribute to freight movement? Well, it frees up some of the general purpose lanes for the benefit of vehicles that are transporting freight. These are in various stages of completion. Significant number of these are completed already. And some of those HOV lanes are open to traffic. We anticipate that by the end of this calendar year, we will have that project, or all those projects, fully completed and open to traffic. The I-5 South Corridor project, this one is a little bit more of a challenge, primarily because of the constraints that exist along that corridor. A significant amount of utility relocation that was required, a significant amount of constraints associated with railroads, so railroad grade crossings and impacts associated with that. We are currently at completion with 3 of those projects. 2 of them are still under construction. We anticipate open to traffic by 2021. And the Gerald Desmond Bridge. So if you were on the tour yesterday, you may have seen the tops of the towers on the boat tour of this facility. This is Port of Long Beach project being constructed currently. It's a significant improvement over what the existing condition is. This will have 3 lanes in each direction plus shoulders. I think the existing facility has 2 without shoulders, at least for a major portion of that. Also will provide a pedestrian and bike path with scenic overlooks on the west side of that new bridge. 205 feet clearance. I don't know if you can read those numbers or not. So the length is about 8,800 feet. 40 cables per tower, and this is a cable stay bridge. Ray can probably talk more about the details on something like that. But definitely will be an iconic bridge once it is completed. This is anticipated to be 2021, early 2021. There's been some delays because of the difficulty in the construction requirements that are associated with that. It's a design build being delivered by the port. We're providing the oversight. When the project is complete, we will take over ownership of that facility. Um, 28 by 28, I mentioned that. So in 2028, what happens in LA are the Olympics. So we are in preparation stage working with our local partners to improve our facilities so that we can accommodate the volume of traffic that we anticipate, utilizing our state facilities as well as the local networks. Significant amount of those or number of those projects are transit related, making transit improvements. There's also a few highway projects. When the city went to put in the application for having the Olympics in the region, one of their focus areas was that they wanted to utilize existing facilities to the maximum extent without building new facilities strictly for the Olympics. And that is the focus that we are providing on the state highway system. Certainly we need to make some improvements to accommodate, but we are not constructing significant new lanes, for example, on the system to strictly accommodate just the Olympic traffic. The way I look at it is it's really a springboard for the future of transportation in our region, making sure that we are accommodating transit, we're accommodating bike and ped, as well as addressing some of the bottleneck areas that we have on our existing system to reduce congestion. One of those projects is the 5760 Confluence project. Ray knows a lot about this one because he lives right in that area. So this is broken up into 3 separate phases. Phase 1 and Phase 2 are primarily the westbound connectors from 57 onto 60, and then from 60 on to 57. And those are substantially complete. About $30 million worth of work for those. This third phase, which is the big one, is the eastbound direction connectors. And that's about a $250 to $280 million project. That one is currently in design. We anticipate that being constructed by 2027, just in time for the Olympics. So with that, I again want to welcome you to District 7.
Thank you, John. And I'll get you for not sitting up here with me eventually. All right, so moving along our agenda. Again, it's just so awkward to sit up here all by myself. The next item on our agenda is agenda item number 3, and it's the welcome and overview of goods movement in the Southern California region. And so our next speaker is Mr. Kome Ajise, Executive Director of the Southern California Association of Governments. So many of you know Kome. You may remember he used to run CFAC for many, many years. So freight is in his blood. But he currently leads the nation's largest metropolitan planning organization with over 30 years of experience in regional and transportation planning, including being my boss for a long time as chief deputy. So with that, let's welcome Mr. Kome Ajise. Come on up, Kome. And you could sit wherever you want, or you can stand.
I would sit with you. I'm not like John. I don't know what's wrong with the man, but...
We're going to guilt him into feeling guilty. Yeah.
Oh, no. Ray's here?
Right in front, too. See what you've been missing.
Yeah, I miss this. You know, they remind me that I shouldn't have left because they make me wear this kind of stuff now. Yeah. I got to have my ID check before I come in the building. Oh, my goodness. Anyhow, good morning, everybody. Oh, my goodness. You're all sleepy.
Good morning, Kome.
Thank you. They forgot.
I know, they forgot. They missed you, that's why.
Well, it's a privilege to be here. As usual, I enjoy talking freight. I was telling somebody a couple of days ago how I missed my Friday freight meetings. Used to have those freight sessions every Friday. Remember that? Yeah?
Yeah.
That was fun. That was at Caltrans. And where we are today, it's a privilege to be in Southern California and welcome you to SCAG region. The SCAG region is there a clicker?
You just say next slide, please. There's a gentleman over there you can't see that's doing it.
All right, next slide. All right, good. Thanks for that. Well, the SCAG region is the single largest metropolitan region in the world, in the U.S. I have to say this because it's part of my contract to remind everybody how big we are and how much we demand half the resources in the state. We're almost half the population of the state, and about 6% of the U.S. population. So it's a tremendous market just by itself. And I think that's the fact that sometimes gets lost. And so with regards to freight, the essence of freight is a market. What's the point of moving goods if it's not to serve people? And so where you have a large population like you have in the SCAG region, freight's very, very important. But beyond that, the SCAG region is also a national gateway to trade, and we proudly represent the entire country by being this access to the tradeways across the globe. At this point, we're in the middle of developing a regional transportation plan, and so freight obviously is on the mind, and you'll hear some more from Annie shortly. So I'm going to try not to steal her thunder. Next slide. I was beginning to say that freight is critical to our region, and we feel like we're actually in stewardship on freight for the rest of the country. It's about a third. You've heard this before. You're a CFAC, so you know all these facts. It's about a third of our gross regional product, and it's critical to the economy of this region. We are the single largest economic region in the country. Freight accounts for a third of that, and so we feel very, 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 one, privileged, but also very responsible for the stewardship that we have. The freight industry within the region includes everything from manufacturing, construction to logistics, to warehousing, and everything in between. That's what accounts for our freight economy in Southern California. These industries depend on the transportation network, and I think you heard from John talking extensively about the work that's going on the system. The essence of that kind of work is to continue to make sure that we allow our regional economy to thrive, which obviously freight has a part in that. An overwhelming majority of the goods that we have in the region is actually generated by local businesses. People always think that we have all this stuff come into the ports and then they just get dispersed across the country. But in fact, a lot of the goods that come in to Southern California stays in Southern California because we're such a tremendous market anyway. And so there's a lot of people employed in the movement of goods and services as a result. The next slide sort of gives you a sense of the import of the Southern California port complex and the goods movement complex. It's a critical linchpin to global trade. We feel like, I think we've done this study where just about every congressional district is affected by what goes and comes out of the San Pedro ports. If that's not important as a national resource, I don't know what else is. And so whenever we go across to D.C., we always remind folks that our goods movement infrastructure in Southern California is critical, not just the region or the state, but to the entire country. It's a very important element of the global supply chain system. We obviously have some issues. There's technology that's kind of out there changing the dynamics of how goods get moved. There are things that go from just the size of the ships that show up anymore at our ports to machine learning to digital printing. There's all kinds of things that are beginning to affect the concept of goods movement, and those are things that we're trying to take in stride. We're seeing alignments in the freight business across the globe. Those alignments have implications for how the boats get aligned and show up at the ports. But we're also seeing the effects of the Panama Canal and, of course, the fierce competition we have with ports across the rest of the country. In the main, I think we would still expect that with all of that competition, with all of those changes in the dynamics of goods movement, we're still favored because of just the strategic location and the efficiency of the port structure that we have and the goods movement infrastructure we have in Southern California to continue to hopefully maintain market share. And that is part of the goal. Next slide. What the next slide shows is along the lines of the fact that with all of the competition, with all of the changes and dynamics in trade and goods movement, we still expect to continue to see a continued growth in inflows of goods through Southern California. And so that it's not going to relent until we, I think, come close to capacity. My sense is we're going to double over our plan period between now and 2040. We're probably going to double the amount of goods that come in. Now, time will tell whether technology changes the modality of how the goods show up. I think since 1995, my notes indicate that we've seen a tripling of TEUs coming into the ports, and that trend continues. By 2045, the number of TEUs is expected to double before reaching the port's constrained capacity. That's assuming the constrained capacity will not be expanded. Now, what that then suggests is, when you start to think about it, it doesn't take someone like Ray Wolf to figure this out. I gotta pick on you. You're right in front of me. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure it out that while we anticipate this doubling of inflows, our base infrastructure, that supportive infrastructure to goods movement, the rail and the land access and the highways, are going to only be marginally expanded. And so we have to imagine that some different kind of technology has to be brought to bear. What that is, I'm probably too old to figure it out right now, but I'm an optimist, I'm a technology optimist, and I feel like at some point we'll figure it out and we'll find a way to get goods in and out of the port structure that we have here in Southern California. Next slide. This is basically talking about the same thing, but with a focus on manufacturing. The other thing that I think is understated about the Southern California region is it's the single largest manufacturing region in the country. Oftentimes when you listen to CNN or some other network, you imagine that manufacturing is all about the Midwest. And people talk about manufacturing jobs and they talk about the Midwest. And they don't ever talk about Southern California. But we are the single largest manufacturing region in the world. In this, I keep saying the world, but maybe. I think China has us beat, but in the country we are. And so that's what this slide sort of indicates. And the only region that's larger than Southern California is California. But people don't associate manufacturing with California, and it's one of those misnomers when we don't sell it as the basis of our economy, because we have a lot of other things going for us in California. But if you can imagine that if the rest of the country were convinced that manufacturing is California is the leader in manufacturing, I think some heads might explode, because that would require us to change our paradigm nationally in terms of how we talk about creating manufacturing jobs. We always think about the Midwest and the old Rust Belt. And so, of course, when you manufacture goods, you got to move them. So it's an essence of our goods movement infrastructure, is the fact that we have a large manufacturing infrastructure also in California. Go on to the next slide. So this slide is intended for you to be mesmerized while SCAG staff go out and pick your pockets and take all the money you have. So keep focusing on the slide. Again, the intent here is to, one, in an elegant way, show some of the challenges of, we've laid the groundwork that this is an important element of our economy. In other words, it's an existential issue that we support and continue to grow our goods movement infrastructure in Southern California. But we're also saying that there are some critical issues that we need to deal with. One is, how do we continue to sustain the growth and support it with continued constraints on all other aspects of how you get goods in and out of there. Secondly is obviously the issues of air quality. If you look at the map to the lower right, lower left, that's your highway system that's supporting the goods movement infrastructure, and you could see a lot of reds in there, so there's a lot of constraints in the highway system. If we talk about mode shift, we have constraints on the Class 1 railroads, and so maybe there's a different solution in between the highways and the Class 1s that we need to start talking about as we talk about growth in Southern California. We're seeing a significant growth in both the passenger rail and freight rail over time, and we expect to continue to see that grow, especially as we try to move folks out of single occupant vehicles and grow our regional rail system. So these conflicts will be at play where we have some constraints already in the freight system. Now we're going to take some of that capacity to also try and run passenger rail. And and you're not going to double capacity on the highway system. So these are some of the issues that we see that that need to be addressed in our planning process, and also as we address our infrastructure funding over time. In Southern California, we currently have approximately 1.2 billion square feet in SCAG region, 1.2 billion square feet of retail space. But the land zone for appropriate industrial use is also disappearing, so we're losing some of that edge. And we continue to see growth in e-commerce. As we see growth in e-commerce, that also has implication for maybe not the large freight movement, but the urban freight issues begin to prop up. So we're seeing issues on all fronts. Sounds like we have full employment opportunity here for folks in freight for the long haul. The next slide. This just demonstrates what we have in our current plan for freight in terms of what we budgeted. The current RTPSES looks to invest about $70 billion in freight and goods movement infrastructure. That's on both on the port complex and on the highway system that supports freight. There's also an indication of need for new freight corridors, not necessarily brand new corridors, but capacity on some well-worn freight corridors. We need an east-west freight corridor, for example. We need to grow our port access. We need a number of grade separations, a number of bottlenecks that need to be remedied, and of course intermodal facilities. And while we're trying to do all of that, we also need to reduce emissions because we have a target of reducing greenhouse gases by 19% by 2035. So there's not a shortage of thought in terms of our need to invest in freight, but it takes a village, and hopefully it becomes one of the issues that's high on the agenda for CFAC. So next slide. Did you take me to the last slide? Okay, I can't see that slide, so and I don't think you can see it either. So let's not talk about it. I think it continues to what the slide shows is it shows the same issues that we've been talking about, the need for mainline enhancements, and on the right, those are the bottlenecks on the highway system that are part of the strategies in the plan that we need to talk about. Let's go to the next slide. Now, don't want to spend too much time on this, but freight also has, this is one of the issues, we're talking about freight as an economic issue. We're talking about freight in terms of jobs and the vitality of the region, but we also have to talk about freight in terms of sustainability, and so there are some environmental components to freight. One is we need to define what technology could do, because there's a play for technology in terms of how we make freight sustainable, and trying to evaluate where and how we get from where we are today to zero emissions in the freight system. I think it's a very important conversation that we're having. Obviously, not everybody's on the same page as to how rapidly we can get to zero emissions. That has to continue to be the goal. We have the greenest ports on the planet, probably in the solar system. I haven't gone to Mars yet to figure out if they have a port complex. But if they did, it wouldn't be as clean as the San Pedro ports. What's that? You're not calling some raised area Mars? Is that what you're saying? Is that what you're saying? No, he's not saying that. I'm trying to get a fight going here because it's boring being out here. And that's an interesting concept that Kerry brings up. I mean, the notion of inland ports is also an element of the conversation we're having in the region, because if you can imagine that we're going to double the inflows of TEUs at the San Pedro ports. We have to find a way to get them rapidly out of the port, inland somewhere, and then do your transloading away from the port system. So that begins to beg the question, do you have an inland port structure that you're planning for? What kind of technology will move you out there? Is it rail? We don't have capacity on rail. Do we need new capacity on rail? And maybe it's I dare say, a hyperloop that gets us out there. But we have to continue to think and imagine that we need a way to get out. But when you look at a port structure, a port complex in Southern California, they've done their best to be as green as possible with yard trucks, with some of the drayage, and they've advanced even into community improvements, and they're very community sensitive. But once you get away from the port complex, there's an obligation on the rest of us to continue to green the goods movement infrastructure. And how we do that, I think, is also one of the challenges. We need to scope those projects, begin to determine where we're going to implement those, and what kinds of, whether it's infrastructure solutions or operational solutions or technology solutions, those projects need to start to bubble up for consideration and development. The next slide just talks about technology. I think these are some of the technologies we've talked about here. In fact, I remember this slide from at least a couple of years ago in the conversations we were having about the potential for technology in goods movement. So you're not strangers to that. And I think that's the end of the presentation. It's really a delight to be here, and it's good to see you all.
Thank you, Kome. We always appreciate you coming and visiting with us again. We do miss you on CFAC, so you're always welcome.
Yes, thank you. Now, I'm going to say something about Coco, since I have a mic, and they're not kicking me off the stage.
Away from you.
I think it's on the agenda. I know, and this is hard. This is hard because she knows what I'm going to talk about. Coco is one of the best human beings I know on this planet. One of the best human beings, no question. And I've had the privilege of working with her for so many years. And she is a consummate professional. I don't know anything, honestly, I don't know anything she's ever done wrong in the time that we've worked together. And I was thinking about this last night once I got some news about what the next steps are for her. And I'm really happy for her. I think she's done well for herself and deserves the next milestone. How many of you know she's retiring?
A few.
Surprise! Yeah. So they didn't know.
Not everyone.
I love this. Breaking news.
Yeah, there you
Forget
go.
everything I ever talked about before now. This is the best thing you want to hear.
So now you have something where I did something wrong. You can add it to your list.
Anyhow, I just feel like I would be remiss if I didn't appreciate her publicly, because we've worked well together, and she has been one of the best support I had when I was at Caltrans in getting things done and making us look good. And she's very quiet about her role and very understated. She's a reluctant leader. She's always been a reluctant leader, but she is a fantastic leader. And so if you would just take a moment to appreciate this lady for me on her retirement.
Well, you didn't make me cry, Kome, so I came very close. But thank you for your kind words and for telling everybody I'm retiring. So I don't know what to say because now I'm speechless. I guess I need to move on. But I did definitely learn from the best. I will give you that. And those of you that know Kome know why I call him the best. Okay, so moving along, thank you again, Kome, for spending time with us this morning at CFAC. So our next speaker, who is also a great friend to CFAC, and is always willing to put her name forward every time CFAC forms a subcommittee or needs anything done, is Annie Nam. So we're going to have Annie come and talk about goods movement freight efforts in Southern California, and she is the manager of goods movement and transportation finance at SCAG. So welcome, Annie.
I can scoot over. Oh, you want to sit at the end? Okay. You have to see the sides. Yeah. I have some notes here. Yeah. Okay. Here we go. So I'm actually going to change it up a little. I'm just going to provide a brief introduction. I don't know if this microphone is on. Hopefully it is. So SCAG was actually asked to provide a brief overview presentation of our recent Caltrans strategic planning grant, or a strategic partnership grant, rather, that we received for our curb space management study. However, we're still in the process of actually developing the scope for that, working with many of our local jurisdictions. And so what we thought we'd do instead is focus on our current study, which is our last mile delivery study that's been underway. We're currently actually wrapping that up. It really serves as the foundation for the curb space management study, and so we thought this was particularly relevant for this group. I think Kome laid it out very broadly with respect to a lot of our challenges and some of the work that we've done. I think traditionally has focused on this sort of really macroeconomic level freight flows. Here we're doing a little shift. I think obviously as a result of a lot of the import supply chain, what's happening with the exponential growth in e-commerce, what's been critical is really what's happening at the urban cores for many of our metropolitan areas with respect to curb space, local streets and roads and curb space, what's happening with local deliveries, and some of the confluence of activities at the curb space just because of multiple users involved, including not just delivery vehicles, but we've seen exponential growth in TNCs and various other new mobility options out there. And so this is really our first attempt to then shift from that macroeconomic assessment and then focus on more of a local jurisdictional case study analysis. So I wanted to actually talk about the fact that we are, I think as we started this study, we took a bit of a pause recognizing that just because things are changing so quickly in the transportation sector, and this is true of the new mobility initiatives as well as that of in the delivery sector, right? And we're grappling with how do we ultimately understand some of what's actually happening? How do we upgrade or update our modeling tools and our data to be able to understand what's happening and forecast out and actually develop long-range plans? I think this is particularly critical for an organization like SCAG that has been predominantly actually focused on long-range planning. And we're at a critical juncture where we're at a pause trying to figure out all of this. And this is really an attempt to take a look at least on understanding what's happening currently. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our goods movement team member here, Scott Strelecki, who's been leading our last mile delivery study, and he's going to walk you through some of the details and some of our findings.
Okay, so I'm on the mic. I'm just going to actually stand right here so I have a better view. Okay, so thanks for the introduction, Annie. I'll just give some real quick highlights of the curb space management study. So like Annie said, in the past we've looked at freight specifically when it comes to last mile delivery, but for the curb space management study, what we really want to do is we want to take a comprehensive look. That means all different modes, those sort of things. E-commerce, ride-sharing activities being one of the core drivers. We know there's always been confluence at curbside, 50, 100 years in history, but at the same time we've got new technologies, new delivery systems occurring, so that's why we really want to focus on this. So next slide, please. So this slide, basically what it's showing is when we think of e-commerce, we automatically think about all the vehicles and all the chaos, what's going on, but really the smartphone is a big is a big impact. All the apps, all the access that people have every second of the day, if you want, really gives consumers a lot of different options as far as creating transparency on products that they're interested in versus taking action. And this kind of has, in a parallel line, an effect on all the companies that are producing goods as well as delivering goods. So basically, this starts changing how people buy, how people receive, return policies being a very big thing that a lot of people now have different expectations. They think they can order something online and just return it very simply. That has implications for the systems of delivery and the infrastructure that supports that. Next slide, please. Kome already talked to us about e-commerce. If we look at the most recent statistics, retail sales are around a little over $3.5 trillion in the U.S. E-commerce is now over $500 billion. As a proportion of that, getting around 15%. So if you look at the slide to the right, that's showing you the relative growth rate. So obviously, traditional retail sales, brick and mortar, you're looking at around 3, maybe 5% growth at the highest annual years, whereas e-commerce is consistently in the double digits, so there's substantial outperformance there. Next slide, please. So when we think about looking to the future forecast, obviously Amazon is a big driver of this. I think for 2018 they were estimated to have about a 35% market share of all e-commerce sales. That's pretty tremendous for one company. And when we look to the future forecast here by a consulting firm, they're looking, I think it's maybe 2030. They're looking at e-commerce growing to about 1.2 trillion, getting closer to about 25% of the total retail sales. And when we're talking retail sales, obviously we're excluding things like automobiles, gas stations, liquor stores, those sort of things. Next slide, please. So we like this illustration because this starts getting us to see from producers to how things are delivered. Traditionally, you had your distribution centers, you're going to retail stores, and people are going there to buy goods. Nowadays, there's a lot of different ways that people can actually access their goods. You can order it online, and it can now go into a residence directly delivered to your home, and that just doesn't lend itself to your FedEx, UPS trucks. That's also less than truckloads coming in, delivering washer and dryers and bulk items and actually installing them and doing things like that. So that's something I think that's of interest. Bulk deliveries are one of the fastest growing e-commerce deliveries right now. And then omni-channel obviously is growing as a increasing competitive stance from companies like Target and Walmart. Amazon's number of products that are available is unparalleled. A lot of companies are having a hard time competing on that front, so they're looking at omni-channel as a defensive way. And I think most recently Target announced that they saw 70% growth year over year from people ordering online, going to the store, parking in the pickup spot, going in and getting their product. So these have a lot of implications on the thought of, if you order something online, are you eliminating trips? Are you creating new trips? What's the net effect of this? So that's something that we think is, very interesting and also very important related to infrastructure. Next slide, please. So at the same token, ride sharing continues to grow. The slide on the left, a little hard to read, but I think you're in the 50 millions in the U.S., getting towards 80 million by the early 2021, 2022 timeframe. The slide on the right is just showing you kind of the profile by age categories from survey information globally, showing that, obviously I think the age groups, 40 younger are really, showing high interest in ride sharing. So it's obviously a global phenomenon. In the U.S., obviously, there's a lot of growth in that as well. Next slide, please. So I just threw this together real quickly today. These are just some really simple stats from Uber and Lyft. Uber is obviously global, but they have a strong presence in the U.S. Lyft is predominantly based in the U.S. So both companies are public. They have prospectus. This is just, high level, mostly probably survey information and some financial metrics. But anyways, when we look at Uber, when they use their monthly active platform customers globally, they have 91 million. That translates to, in 2018, 5.2 billion trips. And of that, 4.7 trillion vehicle miles traveled in trips under 30 miles. So that's not even all their trips, but I mean, just, thinking about the scale of that business. Gross bookings, that's $50 billion. Net revenues, that's $10 billion. We're not going to talk about whether they make money or not, because they're losing a lot of money, but that's not the point. They have almost 4 million drivers globally, and they have estimated that they're serving 2% of 4.1 billion people, representing 63 countries. Uber Eats, everyone's familiar with ride sharing, the dine out or dine in delivery services that are growing tremendously as well. Uber Eats, of those 91 million users, 15 million of them used Uber Eats, and they are connected to more than 220,000 restaurants, over 500 cities, 1.5 billion sales. Lyft, which is obviously more close to the U.S. since that's the majority of their business. Their drivers, they've got some interesting stats up there. 91% drive fewer than 20 hours a week. 9% are veterans of the armed forces. 34% are over the age of 45. Their riders, 46% use their cars less because of Lyft. 35% do not own or lease a personal vehicle. 52% use it for work commute. 44% start or end in a low-income area. Some of the community information, I won't go through everything. I think the most interesting, there's 14% use Lyft to connect to public transit. So again, these are really high-level statistics, but interesting nonetheless, especially if we could get more insights into our specific region. Their scale definitely lower than Uber, but again, that's just focused in the U.S. So they've got 19 million active riders, 620 million rides, things and revenue. Next slide, please. Okay, so for the last mile freight study, I think Annie kind of led into this, but basically it was an initial attempt at really understanding from the freight perspective what's going on with delivery. So we obviously had to take into account delivery conditions, look at what are the challenges that are currently occurring, and try to figure out a way to quantify this, and then ultimately look at strategies, potential solutions. And our primary objective at the end of the study was to try to get some progress towards developing high-level concepts of what type of pilot projects could be considered as a result. Next slide, please. So ultimately, if we just kind of break it down real simply, the focus was on Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles only, just because of the resources we had, and obviously there's so many different areas that are affected by this. Stakeholder input was a big part, data collection, and then creating a toolbox, and ultimately the concepts. Next slide, please. So for the citywide data analysis, we looked at existing conditions, and the way that we did that was we took into account demand indicators of delivery vehicles. We looked at land use density, intensity, obviously. We looked at accident information as well as citation data to try to put all these different variables together to look from the City of Los Angeles perspective, where were the major areas that we should be focusing on for the study. Next slide, please. So the map's a little small on there, but this map is reflecting those different variables, and then it's showing you throughout the City of Los Angeles kind of like when you put them together where you're getting the most activity or demand. So obviously the downtown area stands out with the blue, yellowish, red, everything kind of in a confluence together. But we did note that West Los Angeles, other areas to the north, there were some implications suggesting that we should be focusing on those areas as well. We also looked towards San Pedro area. So this assessment kind of helped frame the case study areas. You can see up towards the right, the different locations that resulted from that. Next slide, please. Stakeholder input was very valuable in working with big companies. We got up there, food service is obviously a huge last mile delivery generator, UPS package delivery, but we also tried as best as we could to look at the retailers, the actual receivers who are making the decisions on when the deliveries come, stock and inventory, making all those things and getting the stuff to their final business location. We did interviews with them, was very effective in getting insights, understanding, and helping frame feedback into the ultimate study. Next slide, please. So data collection, we had two approaches. We used video camera, just time-lapse camera, and we also used technicians to collect data. We felt like the video camera technology was good in just giving us a lot of data, but then it lacked in having clear defining of different vehicle types. It was very hard to distinguish whether a vehicle was an Uber or a Lyft by just having a camera at a certain location without, being able to see the names on the windshields or those sort of things. So from the technician side, we had better identification of whether it was a transportation network company, package delivery company, less than truckload company, all those sort of things. So that gave us a lot more information. And we collected about 8,500 different data points throughout multiple weekdays. I believe late April through September was when the data was collected. And so when we look at the technician data, we can really drill into a particular location, the actual blocks, and we can distinguish between, what's package delivery, what's, food service, what's, construction related, those sort of things. So that, gives us a little more granularity on what's really going on. Next slide, please. So these next few slides are just really high level. I'm not going to spend much time on them. They represent the entire database of collection. So as you can see, we identified different curb types by red, parking, yellow, driveway, crosswalk, white, alley. And the parked was a passenger vehicle indicator that it was parked. Passenger was related to passengers getting in and out of a vehicle. We did incorporate transit. We did incorporate just personal vehicles as well as TNCs. And the loading was specifically related to freight. Next slide, please. So duration is obviously one of the most important aspects of the study. We were able to, by curb type, identify what the activities were and the duration. And this is just comprehensive of the entire data set. Again, we could drill down into any case study area or block location. Next slide, please. This is just a high-level example of what I was referring to. When we look at just the technician side of the data on the freight, about 61% of the vehicles were delivery related. And of those, about 70% were your package and parcel, so that reflected the majority in the locations we looked at. And the thing that I think is very interesting is 25% of deliveries were made by a personal vehicle. So that kind of changes the dynamics of when you're thinking about how you create curb space, how you think about freight being delivered. We noticed a shift in that. Next slide, please. For the technician data, we were also able to tease out the TNC information since we had more granularity. So including bus transit, we noted that TNC reflected 10% of all passenger loading. If you exclude the bus, it's closer to over 20%. Next slide, please. This is just nothing earth-shattering here. This is just showing your blue shaded data in the background that we collected that, business hours is when the majority of deliveries occur. That's, understood. The chart to the right is just kind of showing there is a confluence of peak period activity where our freeways are most heavily utilized with the actual delivery trips beginning and ending, adding to that issue. Next slide, please. So as I said, we have a final report and toolbox of strategies. Toolbox of strategies was our best practice approach, did extensive literature review across the United States as well as a little international. And our goal of that was to create opportunities for, maybe there's a simple improvement like, hey, we need to extend a yellow curb, that makes the most sense based on this block, versus other strategies looking at maybe pricing considerations, permitting, things like that. Next slide, please. So we broke it up into kind of three general areas, looking at the literal curb area, like I said, trying to understand delivery and receiver potential options that they would be interested in, as well as other kind of applications or other implementation considerations like education and enforcement. Next slide, please. So this is just an example showing you some of the illustrations of how the toolbox was put together. So for instance, if there was an area where you could potentially consider, passenger parking during certain times of the day versus, freight parking at other times, those sort of things, as well as coating the curb being a significant undertaking, but then at the same time having benefits of management strategies or opportunities versus designating areas potentially as commercial only, as you see there, versus optimal areas to distinguish between passenger commercial. Next slide, please. So at the same token, I think we've been talking about emerging trends, technology here. So, complete streets has been something that's been ongoing. Freight has maybe not been incorporated that earlier on, but I think as time has gone by, it's become more important that freight needs to be a consideration as far as that. We all hear about autonomous vehicles and what that means. There's a lot of pilots going on with specifically related to grocery deliveries. Shared mobility concepts, all those sort of things. So, we tried to capture some of that as well in the study. Next slide, please. And up here is just a listing of some of the pilot project concepts that we were looking at. So we got a lot of feedback from some package delivery companies that there was an interest in e-bike delivery. That doesn't eliminate a truck as a part of that delivery, but at the same time, you could potentially combine zero-emission truck with your e-bike delivery system, and then you start, getting different benefits as a result of that. Off-peak delivery, food service companies expressed interest in that. That had been piloted in other parts of the country as well. Consolidation centers, not necessarily looking to add another consolidation aspect of multiple companies, but potentially using it for specific companies, maybe if there was opportunities. Common carrier lockers, I think everyone probably familiar with Amazon lockers, but there's been a little more growth in real estate developments for residential, multifamily that are looking more at having lockers in their communities. Express park module, considering what's currently existing on the passenger side and seeing what potential applicability there could be for freight for a similar approach. Other opportunities of integrating postal service guidelines into building codes, and then, like I said, more not simple, but rudimentary approaches of how we could make improvements. Next slide, please. So where we're at is we are in the midst of completing the study. We're hoping to finalize it this summer, and we continue to work with all stakeholders. I didn't mention earlier, obviously, we're working with City of Los Angeles stakeholders, LADOT, and the Department of Community Planning. So we continue to have discussions, and we're looking forward to potentially actually getting some of these pilot projects going. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. All right, that was a great presentation. Give us a lot of things to think about, especially as we move on to agenda item number 5, which is the California Freight Mobility Plan status update. So this next topic is just an update presented by Nieves Castro. So those of you that don't know Nieves, she's the Assistant Division Chief at Caltrans Headquarters Transportation Planning. So welcome, Nieves, and we're looking forward to hearing the update.
Good morning. I'm still a little flustered from the news we just heard. So I want to say congratulations, Coco. I'm still shocked, though.
That Come.
So once again, good morning. For the CFMP update, we'd like to share the revised schedule. At the last CFAC meeting in Oakland, Caltrans announced that we'd be presenting the draft CSMP at this meeting. However, since then, we've had a couple of changes. First, we have a new investment strategy approach. Many of you are already engaged in that conversation. So Chris Schmidt will be presenting that in a little bit later on the agenda. And the second, the plan isn't being sent to FHWA for approval after all. Without reauthorization, FHWA considers the 2014 CFMP and the 2018 addendum compliant with the FAST Act. So that's given us a couple of extra months. So as a result, we are pushing back the schedule a couple of months. Can you put the
next slide?
Well, you all have it in your packets, so you can follow along. So the draft is going to be shared with Caltrans Executive Management and Agency the end of this month, July 29th. It'll go for CTC and public review starting on September 9th. And the plan will be presented at the next CFAC in early September. Final plan will be presented to CTC in October, and it'll go for final review November and still on schedule to be completed by the end of this calendar year. So that's the latest on our update. Are there any questions on this schedule? Nothing at all?
I'm not seeing any questions from any of the CFAC members or attendees, so, okay.
Good.
All right. I mean, I think it's an aggressive schedule, and I think as we jump into the next topic that Chris is going to provide on the investment strategy, which is a huge component of the freight mobility plan approach, I think you'll see, that's when we really want everybody to kind of chime in and participate and make sure that that investment strategy is representative of the direction we want to move forward in. So I'm sure you're saving all of your energy and comments and questions for that discussion. All right. So we're going to move on to our next update. The next item is an update on the critical urban and rural freight corridor strategy and interregional strategic plan update. So this topic will be presented by Jeff Monroe, and he is the branch chief for the Office of Freight Planning. And then Scott Sauer is also here, who's chief of multimodal systems planning, also from headquarters planning, to provide an update. I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Hello?
Should be on. I am very lonely. That's why I retired now.
Thank you, Coco.
Yeah.
There we go. Yeah, thank you. My name is Jeff Morneau. I'm the branch chief for the freight planning branch at Caltrans headquarters. And my office is in charge of the critical urban freight corridor and critical rural freight corridor designation process. And the purpose of my presentation is just kind of to give you an overview of the program and an update on where we are in terms of that whole process. So we'll go to the next slide. So just to give you a really quick overview, the FAST Act, which was passed by President Obama in 2015, required the designation of a National Highway Freight Network. And that National Highway Freight Network is composed of four components, one being the primary highway freight system, and non-primary highway freight system interstates, and critical urban freight corridors, and critical rural freight corridors. So those are the four components that make up the National Highway Freight System. For any project, and also the FAST Act, passed by President Obama, also created the National Highway Freight Program, which is a funding source specifically dedicated to freight projects. So in order for a project to be considered for the National Highway Freight Program, it needs to be on the National Highway Freight System. So, within California, we already have the primary highway freight system and non-primary highway freight system interstates designated. But the critical urban freight corridors and the critical rural freight corridors are up to the states and the MPOs to designate. And these critical corridors are essential to designate corridors throughout California where we deem freight to be essential and to be eligible for National Highway Freight Program funds. Can I have the next slide? This microphone's kind of cutting out for some reason.
Yeah, it's awkward. Yeah, here, we'll switch.
Okay. So
what is a critical urban freight corridor? So these are corridors. So, hello? Technical difficulties, okay. We can roll with that. So critical urban freight corridors are located within urbanized areas that are over 500,000 people in the urbanized area. And MPOs take the lead in terms of designating the critical urban freight corridor miles. For critical rural freight corridor miles, those are in areas that are under 50,000 people. And so for critical rural freight corridors, the state takes the lead. And there are also critical urban freight corridors that are between 50,000 and 500,000 people. Those are considered small urban freight corridors. And the state works in consultation with the MPOs on those as well. So it's a really collaborative process. Critical urban freight corridors are meant to connect intermodal facilities to the primary highway freight system and to add the first and last miles of routes to the national highway freight network. For critical rural freight corridor miles, those are meant to connect more rural things like mining facilities and granaries and other types of facilities to the primary highway freight system. In both CUFCs and CRFCs, the state can and the MPO can determine if those can justify those as being essential to the movement of freight in California, and that can be used as a justification to designate those CUFCs and CRFCs. So far, we have not designated that many CUFCs and CRFCs. As you can see, California is allocated 311 miles of critical urban freight corridors, but we've only designated 27.61 miles of those CUFCs. For critical rural freight corridors, California is allocated 623 miles, but we've only designated 39.3 of those CRFCs. So there's really an abundance of miles that we're not designating, and that's kind of the issue that we're trying to address here. Can I have the next slide? California has something called the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program, the TCEP, and that TCEP is made up of a combination of Senate Bill 1 funds and also National Highway Freight Program funds. And as you can see, the TCEP is meant to address several different types of freight projects, from ports to rail to highway improvement projects to intelligent transportation systems and environmental community mitigation funds or improvements. Okay, next slide. Between fiscal year 17-18 and 19-20, the TCEP had $1.3 billion. Depending on reauthorization, we've projected that the next round of TCEP, which is still being drafted, could be $2 billion within fiscal years 2020 through 2025. But of course, that's dependent on reauthorization and the CTC. But the point is that we need to be positioned in order to take advantage of those funds, and that's why we need to take advantage. That's why we need to designate these CUFCs and CRFCs, and also complete our California Freight Mobility Plan to position us for these funds if they become available. Okay, next slide. So like I said, there's really an abundance of CRFCs and CUFCs that are available to California, but we've only designated a very small number of them. And the issue is that we could potentially lose those miles. We don't know, but we could lose them if we don't really utilize them like we should be, and like other states are. And the question was, why haven't we designated them? It's because we haven't really been, well, we've created a process to designate these miles by identifying segments throughout California where projects could happen, where we want projects to be funded, but this process hasn't been effective in terms of designating all of these miles that are allocated to California. So we're thinking of a new proposal that I'm going to go over pretty soon. Can I have the next slide? So the proposal is that we are thinking of using the interregional transportation strategic plan as kind of a basis to look at corridors that throughout California that are not part of the National Highway Freight System, but are essential to the movement of freights and to the economy of California. We're thinking of using the ITSP to look at corridors where we could designate CUFC and CRFC miles. And we're also thinking of perhaps having a buffer, maybe 10 to 20%, that would allow us to give us still enough miles to allocate on other parts of California to include in the National Highway Freight System. So I'm going to pass it off to Scott Sauer. Scott is the lead for the Interregional Transportation Strategic Plan, and he's going to provide more background on the ITSP and why we're using that as a justification.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Again, Scott Sauer, Office Chief for Multimodal System Planning. If you're going to actually, can you skip one more slide over? I'm going to track to that one. So I'm going to have a quick explanation of what the ITSP is and kind of why we're thinking about consistency with that, and not only the rural miles that we identified here, but also the freight plan. It's one of the 6 modal plans that implements the California Transportation Plan. As you might guess from the title, it's focused on interregional travel. At one point, that was kind of what we thought of as the highway plan, but really it's a multimodal plan that really focus on interregional travel throughout the state. 3 of the goals that we really have, the real purpose of it is to articulate a vision and approach for investing in the interregional system. We want to use it to improve interregional movement of people and goods, and identify a framework that guides investment into the interregional transportation improvement program. Basically, help Caltrans make the decision on how we're going to invest in ITIP funds or IP funds. In 2015, we completed the last plan. That's the one we're using at this point. We're at the initial process of updating it, and we expect to have that updated in 2021. We want it to be updated after the CTP, make it a little bit easier for us to implement the CTP. So interregional travel, let's talk about that real quickly. Obviously, interregional, we wanted to connect the major regions throughout the state. Actually, go back to the map. So we want to connect the major regions of the state. And California is a really big state, so we have big regions. And these are the 8 ones we have identified: North Coast, North State, the San Francisco Bay Area. We have the Greater Sacramento region, the Central Coast, Central Valley, Eastern California, and Southern California. Those are 8 regions. The key is the type of travel we're looking at is freight, and that's one of the major elements of it. Interregional tourism, and then basic access. And the basic access for your North State, your North Coast, those ones where you need to make sure there's some access, and a lot of this kind of aligns to your emergency evacuations. The type of travel we're looking at is long distance, non-commute related auto and truck trips. Also, intercity rail services that generally are more than 100 miles. So the key is the non-commute for us. So the elements of it, as you can see, there are the 8 regions that we have up there. We identified 11 strategic interregional corridors, and you can look at the plan to get into more detail on this. And basically the travel sheds that link those different regions, like North Coast to the San Francisco Bay Area, and North Coast to the Southern California. There's Southern California to Central Valley and to Sacramento, San Francisco. So really those connections between those regions. And in those, we identified and analyzed the different travel patterns, the different routes, and came up with priority interregional facilities. If you're familiar with the old focus routes we had in the past, that's kind of what they are. But they're a little bit bigger. In the focus routes, we didn't include interstates. We only include highways, and we separated the rail lines with the highways, but we put them all together as equal footing. And basically, it's intercity rail service. We have high-speed rail, interstates, freeways, and highways are the key facilities we look at. So why we are bringing this up is, as I said, freight is a key element of the ITSP, a key element of interregional travel. So we want to have consistency with the ITSP, not only with the freight plan, but with the critical rural and urban corridors. And since Caltrans, when we invest and we use our ITIP funds, we generally invest in the priority interregional facilities that are in the rural areas. That's how we use our ITIP funds. And one of the major reasons I said is to support freight. And so we would having consistency between those critical rural freight corridors and our priority interregional facilities just kind of makes sense, and it makes consistency with the plan and really aligns those funding sources a little bit better. So that's a quick overview of the plan, and I'll hand it back off to Jeff.
One more slide. Yeah, thank you, Scott. So like Scott said, we are considering using the ITSP as a basis to define areas throughout California where we could use these CUFC and CRFC miles. Just in terms of the process, we would identify routes using the ITSP and the latest data on traffic counts, and we want to work closely with the MPOs and RTPAs in this process. And one thing I want to mention is that there is a CUFC, CRFC technical working group that actually was convened several years ago, and they convened several times in the past, and we recently reconvened it to go over this proposal. And there weren't any real objections to this proposal, and we were given the instruction to move forward with it. We are working closely. This technical working group is made up of MPOs and RTPAs throughout the state, so their input is very essential to this whole process. In terms of the process, we would work closely with the MPOs and RTPAs in designating these CRFCs and CUFCs to make sure that they're appropriate. And once we've certified these routes, we send them to FHWA essentially, where they certify it and they update their National Highway Freight network maps. Can I have the next slide? So we've done some preliminary analysis. Using the ITSP as a basis, we've looked at 3 different corridors throughout California. One would be the Central Coast, which is 101 from LA up to, I believe, Santa Clara County. So that would be 101, and that we would also include 152 and 156, which are essential for agricultural movements in the Salinas Valley and Monterey. And also 41 and 46, which is in San Luis Obispo, that connects San Luis Obispo to Kern County. And we've used GIS to determine which parts of those routes are urban and which parts are rural. Other corridors that we've done some preliminary analysis on are 101 North between the Bay Area and Humboldt, and also US 395 between Southern California to the Nevada border. Considering all 3 of those corridors combined, they provide far more mileage than we have available. So can I have the next slide, actually? So in terms of critical rural freight corridors, California has 623 rural miles available, and we've only designated 39.3 miles so far, which leaves the state of California with 583 rural miles that we need to designate. And as you can see, the Central Coast really provides it provides 188 rural miles and 224 urban miles, so that's a great candidate. Other candidates are US 101 North and US 395. We're also considering other routes between I-5 and SR 99 in the Central Valley. So essentially, we're trying to use the ITSP as the basis, and we're trying to identify corridors that are essential for the movement of freight in California. And once we have these corridors, we want to consider them for CRFC and CUFC designation. Okay, the next slide. So, as I said, we're working with the CUFC, CRFC technical working group, and we're going to reconvene in a few months, and we have a lot of questions that we need to answer as we go through this process. Some questions such as, do we want to designate the Central Coast as a CRFC and a CUFC? Should we consider other routes throughout California, such as US 101 North, or a part of 395 maybe, or perhaps other routes we haven't considered yet? Another question is, should we maintain a buffer, like a number of miles, just in case we want to designate another part of the state, or another route where a project might be, or where we anticipate a project to be, in anticipation for National Highway Freight Program funds, for TSEP funds. And also, should we consider performance measures? Should we consider truck volumes, truck AADT, or STAA accessibility, or whether the route needs to be upgraded to freeway and expressway standards? So these are all things we should consider as we move forward, and we're going to talk about with the technical working group in the coming months. Okay, the next slide. I've spoken mostly about the critical rural freight corridor miles, which the state is the lead on. We're going to have to work closely with the MPOs, because the MPOs take the lead on the urban miles. And as you can see, there's an abundance of urban miles that still need to be designated. And we're encouraging the MPOs to look at their regional transportation plans and any freight plans that they have adopted, and to use those as a basis for any possible critical urban freight corridor miles that they could designate. Okay, the next slide. In terms of a timeline, we already had our meeting with the technical working group last month, and so Caltrans is planning on taking the lead on these rural designations and trying to process them in August. And we're encouraging the MPOs to take the lead on their urban miles in the month of September. We do want to have a technical working group meeting in September, and hopefully, we could designate these miles by then, with October 2019 being the final date in which we present our recommendations to the next CFAC meeting. So that's generally the timeline. Can I have the next slide? Also, as these CUFCs and CRFCs get designated and approved by FHWA, we are posting them on a Caltrans interactive GIS map where you can easily look at them. And when we post this PowerPoint, the link is up there, and you can easily access it and see, what the existing system is, and also you can see the updates as they're made. So with that, are there any questions? Yes.
Thank you. Is it on? Okay, it's on. Michael Cano, LA Metro. In terms of like the CRFC, really the main point of it is to create eligibility for federal funding to flow to projects that are in rural designation. So I would probably recommend keeping a balance of it if it's not critical, to allow for discretionary choices for infra, for build, for other programs that require that in addition to TSEP. I don't know if it's very easy to move miles here and there quickly. It might be better to not have an assumption that those miles are linked, and then to have the discretion for the state and the local agencies to partner to decide if there needs to be a designation. Since it is rolling and can move from project to project, we need to be agile and flexible with that designation. So I would consider that. I don't know how many miles but at least enough to allow projects to move forward without having to worry about getting that taken care of while trying to do a short-term grant application responding to a notice of funding that might be a 40-day window or 80-day window or something like that. So I just want to put that out to you.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've got Ken.
Thank you, Kenneth Cow with MTC. I have two questions. Number one, well, I guess first, I understand the need to kind of get going on this, and it's probably our bad that we kind of put this on the back burner. But I think some of the regions may have potential rural miles that are kind of intra regional, and we would probably like to talk with you about nominating some of those miles. So to that extent, I would maybe have a little bit of a buffer, like you said, to accommodate some of those. And then I guess my second question is, I know we've been talking a lot about this, and I think the next step for you was to go to the main RTPA group in August. Is that still the case? And then do you anticipate like any kind of major changes between now and then?
Yes, that's correct. We're presenting to that group. I don't anticipate any major changes, but we may have maybe more to share with them at that point.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's see. Peter, here in the front.
I just kind of want to follow up. I mean, obviously, you presented a lot about the designation on the rural routes, not a whole lot on the urban. And so, again, going back, what is the timeline? Because, quite frankly, it was very interesting that what you presented shows no designations in Southern California, where half the population and most of the freight comes through. As was pointed out earlier, it's a global entryway to the entire country. So obviously, if you can't get freight out of Southern California, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference to the rural. But setting that aside, so what's the timeline on the urban designation so we don't lose those miles in funding?
Well, I mean, as for your point about Southern California, that's a great one. And actually, I was just talking to Scott about that. So we do need to do some analysis, perhaps in San Diego, Imperial, San Bernardino, Los Angeles, Orange counties, to see if there are any potential routes there that could be designated as CRFCs or CUFCs.
Well, in all due respect, I think that data is already here. I mean, we know what the critical routes are.
Right.
This might be, Annie can help out here on this one. Maybe we could pass the mic over. But I think it's kind of a little bit of a chicken and egg, like what comes first. So there's been a lot of just sort of patience waiting, like what's the benefit of doing the designation? But I think there's a risk in not doing the designation. And I think that's the quandary that we're in right now. But Annie, did you want to add something to that?
I should clarify, I think it was mentioned earlier that the MPOs are actually taking the lead on the CUFC designations. And in our conversations in the past, what's been the issue is, even though I think many of us were concerned about the limited number of miles initially that were provided to the state of California, we also recognized that then we developed a strategy focused around, well, let's utilize those miles when we need them for purposes of funding allocation. Having said that, I think there were some further clarification that if your segments are already either NHS or a primary freight network, there is no need for additional designation to access the federal funds. And so as a result of that, I think we've inevitably put that on the back burner. Having said that, we have gone through a technical process where we were also working with each of our county commissions as well as the ports on identifying the segments. So we have that, and we are planning on submitting. And the purpose of those designations, however, is to really
hold the designations, and with the understanding that we can fluidly change them out as segments are really needed for funding purposes. So hopefully that explains why there's been a lag in terms of designations, and I believe that's probably the case throughout the state of California as well.
Yep. Sarkis over in the back.
Thank you. Sarkis Kowchak with Santa Barbara County Association of Governments, also here representing the Central Coast agencies. Regarding the critical urban freight corridor designations, we were one of the agencies that received an allocation of the critical urban miles, and we just wanted to say thank you to Caltrans for helping us with the process for designating our corridor. We are one of those regions that has a project that's going to be ready for these grant programs, like Mike mentioned, and so we appreciated the designation for our application. We also support the state's proposal to designate as many corridor miles within some of these rural areas, especially not knowing what's going to happen with these miles with the next reauthorization. So we support being able to designate them, and then if the process changes or if we get more miles in the future, I think at least having those routes designated would be helpful for the state. So thank you.
Right. Do we have a hand in the back right there?
Rob Ball with Kern Council of Governments. I served on the CRFC, CUFC subcommittee that was looking at this issue. One of the key things that we dealt with when we came up with this rolling designation of the critical urban freight, which is why the number's so small, that we're only putting projects out there that absolutely need that designation for a grant application, is that to go the other way, there was like way more than double what the need was. And I mentioned this on the last subcommittee group, is that there needs to be a candidate category for CRFC, CUFC, where we take this list, such as the interregional routes plan, and take a list like that that shows there's 1,500 or 3 times or 4 times what the actual need is. So when the debate comes up in Congress and they ask why we don't have this, all of our routes designated, the real answer is because you didn't give us enough mileage. We need more mileage in the next federal reauthorization for the state of California, and that's one of the key things there. And so we're supportive of increasing the designation, but you're going to get into this turf war battle over, hey, I need twice as much as I've got my pro rata share within my MPO. I need to designate all those areas, and I think the way you solve that is with this candidate category, and you have a map that shows the whole system of critical urban and rural freight networks. Thanks.
Thank you for the suggestion. Any other comments or questions? I mean, I think many of you recall that one of the reasons that even though the process had been in place for the designation, or that process was put in place almost a year ago or over a year ago, is just this notion that, is there risk to the state of California by not taking advantage of even just the designation of this mileage, recognizing that we have the flexibility to adjust and to roll the designations as needed. Because we made such a stink about it that there weren't enough miles for the state of California a couple years ago, and then now with reauthorization, is there a risk that they're going to say, hey, well, they didn't even designate the ones that we did give them? And it's a difficult conversation because it's it's not systematic or comprehensive because there's so many different categories of the network as they're defined, and I don't even know them all off the top of my head, but there's a primary and all of the other ones, and it's really kind of that comprehensive picture that sets the stage for what is the freight network. And I think that's the challenge that we're facing is how is it that we designate, recognizing that there's a larger network and then we have the smaller network of what was designated federally. But I think that's the challenge that we have before us. So luckily, there is this subgroup that's been formed that's going to continue to meet and then come back to CFAC with a recommendation. So this was presented as an informational item, but we've got Carrie, the question or comment up here in the front again.
Just wanted to add a point that the designation is really driven by the funding that's available at the federal level for freight projects, and the NHFP funds, $500 million in the last round for 5 years. I think most of them are all in went to interstate, critical interstate projects, so there was no issue of needing designations. And then obviously that's only a requirement for the NHFP funds. So given the small amount of money, it's not going to be an issue even going forward in the next 5 year, and I think what the CTC will probably assume for the TSEP program.
Okay. Thanks, Carrie. All right, any other comments? Okay, so that puts us right on time. So our next topic is an update or discussion regarding the freight investment strategy. So Chris Schmidt is going to be presenting the next agenda topic, and I think this is one where we really are looking for some feedback and some discussion from everyone in terms of how to approach this component of the freight mobility plan. So you're up, Chris. Everyone's been saving their questions.
Okay. I'm going to do my Phil Donahue thing up here. I assume that's actually why you're here, to find out about this whole freight investment strategy business. So just backing up, and I'm going to repeat myself several times throughout this presentation because you've heard this in previous CFAC meetings. If you've participated in the freight investment subcommittee, thank you, because we've talked about this several times there. And we want to kind of come full circle as to what we're actually trying to accomplish in the plan itself with the investment strategy chapter. The intent really is to have a CFMP that clearly articulates what the freight funding priorities are in the state of California. That it's not just a plan that talks about policy and talks about how desperate our state needs investments and how important freight is to the economy and issues about equity, and I can go on and on. Those are all critical, absolutely necessary to paint the picture of what's important in terms of freight in the state of California. But at the end of the day, the question is going to be, what are we investing funds in to make that system more robust, more resilient, more functional, and to support all those other outcomes that we're seeking to accomplish. So the investment strategy is trying to articulate that with everything I just talked about. So next slide. We had 3 meetings of the subcommittee, and we really walked through developing a methodology and trying to understand what's the best way to articulate the need and to document that within the plan itself. And so at the first meeting, we talked about a method, we talked about some criteria, and we agreed upon that, and we basically had a call for projects. We asked our district staff throughout the state to work with the MPOs to solicit the various projects that might be considered freight projects. And we received quite a few of those, and I'll talk about those here in a second. We looked at that list in the second subcommittee meeting and became pretty apparent that we were missing some key types of projects. It was very intensively focused on state highway projects, but we really didn't include a number of different kinds of modalities that really were sort of selling the whole investment strategy short if we just sort of talked about the investment in the state highway system itself. So what we asked for was to go back out and really identify these, what I highlighted here is multimodal and sustainable freight projects that we missed essentially in the first call for projects. Another thing that was pretty evident was that districts didn't necessarily effectively work with their regional partners to identify the projects overall. So we asked that they do a better job of that and ultimately get a better list for ourselves. In the third meeting here at the end of May, we reviewed what those projects were. We had about 1,200 of these projects, and they ranged from all over the state, a variety of different types of investments. And what we had a conversation about is having a listing of projects is really not an effective way to articulate the overall freight need. And so part of what we want to do today here on July 11th is talk about a slightly more strategic approach to really drill down past the 1,200 project list and really articulate something that's a little bit more strategic in nature for each of the regions within the state. So let me walk you through that. So next slide. when we first started talking about what is a freight project, one of the things that was really key is that the subcommittee said, let's not try to reinvent the wheel here. We have a perfectly good freight definition in the freight plan itself from 2014. That's the same definition we'd like to carry forward into the update of the plan. And it already discusses what we're really trying to define as a true freight project. And so that wasn't intended to change. But this is a key lens through which to view whether a project truly is a freight project or not. What I'm trying to convey here, every project is not a freight project because somehow tangentially it benefits trade or freight. And we need to be really clear about that. When we have 1,200 projects, I don't think all of those really specifically, directly benefit freight. They may do it tangentially in some manner, shape, or form, but if we're going to talk about investing specifically in freight projects and using corridor freight dollars, TSEP dollars, how do we make sure that those are really the biggest bang for the buck? Because ultimately that's something that the Commission is very interested in. Next slide. So freight elements that we talked about including were sustainable freight investments. There was a discussion about that, largely because the state has been focused on that as an interagency priority when we developed the Sustainable Freight Action Plan. We wanted to make sure we're moving towards a cleaner, more sustainable freight industry overall. We certainly highlighted the National Highway Freight Network. You just heard a discussion here about the critical urban and rural corridors. That is a part of that, and it's really key in terms of the federal planning level as to where that freight network resides and how many dollars should be invested there. We obviously acknowledged our ports of entry, both airport, seaport, and border. They're all slightly different, but we wanted to make sure we acknowledged the multimodal nature of our system. Rail infrastructure, while largely a private endeavor in the state, there can be public sector investment to make our rail and our freight rail system work better. Maritime investments of various types, not just in terms of port, but marine highways and investments like that. And then you heard a little bit here from the SCAG region about first and last mile investments, something that is sort of more at a micro scale, not just at the big, corridor level scale where we're typically spending lots of money on a state highway or something, but really thinking about what we can do at a more community-based scale as well. So next slide. To remind folks, the Sustainable Freight Action Plan listed about 12 principles, and these are high-level principles as to what we're trying to do in terms of investing in more sustainable freight overall. These are really a way to evaluate or judge whether the project really truly will get us to that sustainable level. And we wanted folks to really consider that. I thoroughly appreciate that not every RTP has somehow embodied all of these. But I would venture that most of you in developing regional transportation plans for your MPO or RTPA, you've looked at these issues and you've tried to identify those and articulated those through your own policy lens at the more local or regional level. And that's really what we're trying to articulate here at the statewide level as well. So I won't belabor this too much, but really just as a guiding principle, we want to move the freight industry to a more sustainable path. It's just really critical for the state overall. Next slide. So what we did in that first call for projects, we really wanted to create this list of projects. And we basically asked for some time frames to be considered. We really wanted to make sure that we're covering things in the sort of nearer term, meaning that, over the next 5 years, what are we truly thinking we can spend our money on? What's ready to go? What have we been working on in terms of project delivery? And recognizing that those are probably the projects we're going to be submitting for discretionary funding, whether that's federal or state. Then there's a longer time frame here that runs out to 2030 and then 2030 beyond. We're trying to just sort of, categorize that. And most regional transportation plans do that as well, given how folks need to concern themselves with fiscal constraint and their ability to deliver projects. We also then made clear that we wanted all the projects to fall into the freight definition, as I mentioned earlier, along with the alignment with the freight elements that we pointed out in the previous slide, and then the consistency with the Sustainable Freight Action Plan. Projects should also be in an RTP and SCS. If this is completely outside that realm, it really shouldn't be in a state plan at this point. It needs to sort of be developed from the bottom up, and then ultimately, let me just say that once we solicited these, we got an awful lot of projects back, as I mentioned. So using this approach laid out by the subcommittee, can go to the next slide. We received a very large list of projects. And we started to dig through those. We tried to figure out whether we were inclusive, that we really truly captured everything. And we got word back from a number of our RTP and MPO partners that we were not, and we were missing things. We also tried to better understand that the timelines that we thought we were asking for people to identify in terms of 5 years, 10 years, and beyond, that those were really reflective in the list. And it was pretty clear that a lot of the projects were probably much, much longer term, that they might be in an RTP. They may not actually be in the strained part of the RTP, but really in sort of the unconstrained portion of the RTP. And it became very, very clear that this 1,200 project list was not going to be a great source of how we would want to articulate our investment priorities. So with that said, next slide, we went through this initial definitional process, as I mentioned here, and we tried to apply a couple of screens. And I'll be perfectly honest here, we use the Caltrans notion and metric here of, do you have a project initiation document? Meaning, have you done something above and beyond just putting the project in your plan, but have you actually developed scope, cost, schedule to try to figure out when to deliver this thing and what it might cost? When you apply that screen, you go from 1,200 projects down to 160 projects. And that didn't seem quite right to us either, because clearly not every project goes through a Caltrans PID process. So what are we doing here? We then also tried to refine the list slightly differently. We tried to apply some screening criteria. One of the key screening criteria that we tried to apply was PM3. PM3 is one of the federal performance measures for truck travel time reliability. And notice I said truck travel time reliability, so this is really just focused on trucking, and it doesn't really include some of the other sector investments. And tried to do that and really notice that we can evaluate on-system, on-highway project performance, but we're completely missing the rail, maritime, port of entry types of projects that we also want to invest in. So it's not really a particularly good metric, which speaks to the need for other metrics, which makes things kind of more difficult. So we tried to do this project refinement, but the more we looked at how to refine and how to screen down and how to evaluate the 1,200 projects, the more difficult it becomes. And I would submit to you, all of you suffer from the same thing at the regional level. Trying to pick winners or losers is not easy to do, because there's lots of parochial priorities, and we want to make sure that we reflect those in the plan. So it says caution there, because we don't want to be in the business to be exclusionary. We want to be inclusionary, but you know, when the community is so large that we have 1,200 projects, it also doesn't really help with identifying key priorities. So next slide. So we asked for some refinements as a result of this, and try to walk through with the committee how to take that 1,200 project list down further. We solicited, as I mentioned earlier, these non-highway projects that had some type of scoping document associated with them as well. So we could be a little bit more certain that the project was a little more ready to go, a little bit more baked, if you will. And then we try to apply some additional performance measures. These performance measures weren't so much truck-based, but really trying to understand better who's served, what communities, what travel corridors, what freight sheds, did they address some bottlenecks, et cetera, in the overall system as a whole. So next slide. So here are some of those measures. We used travel time reliability, as I mentioned earlier, a little bit about safety, speed. We looked at bottlenecks. Also tried to utilize CalBC type ratio, where we've got a number of different performance criteria built into CalBC. For those of you who use that, it's a fun tool, lots of inputs, and then you got to figure out whether you've got good cost benefit. And then we were also focused on vehicle miles travel, under the notion that to the extent that projects should support reductions in vehicle mile travels overall in terms of our greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, you know, how would we manage to do that? So these are difficult criteria, and for those of you, you know, who again develop freight plans at the regional level or regional transportation plans, you all apply various criteria to evaluating projects as well, right? So you can appreciate when you try to do it at a regional scale how difficult that is. Trying to do that at the statewide scale becomes even more difficult. And really, there is no elegant way to do this. There isn't a single set of metrics. Certainly, these metrics aren't easily applicable to all project types. And so trying to screen these things down comes quite difficult. So the next slide. What we did when we had this resubmittal, there were really two focus areas. One was to screw down on the timeline, to really say, look, let's look at the projects from 2020 to 2025. And that turned out to be about 275 projects, which got a lot closer to where we need to be in terms of articulating true strategic investments. And they fell in a broad group of categories here. First of all, the breakdown by location, whether it's at the regional or district scale. We had rail project, port projects, highway projects, non-highway projects, airport projects, multimodal stuff, et cetera. And there were a lot of different project types. Many of them were falling into capacity expansion, as you might anticipate, but there were also some falling into operations and maintenance, and some falling into system preservation. So there were some projects that, were looking at deteriorating infrastructure in terms of how to preserve and to extend the useful life. So this started to get a lot clearer to us that there's definitely a way to articulate these needs a little bit more directly once you start applying some of these sensibilities and recognize we're still really only talking about that 5-year time window. So good, but now the question became, how do we actually put this in the plan? How do we articulate this? So next slide. One of the thought processes was, maybe rather than having a list of projects and a discussion about sort of the kind of criteria and the definitions that we've been working on to guide us putting this list together, maybe we should take a different approach. Maybe we should really try to articulate these priorities more strategically at a corridor level. And the reason that discussion came up is the current guidelines that the Commission uses to make funding decisions relies on corridor definitions. This goes all the way back to the TCIF program under Prop 1B, which carried over into the guidelines for TCEP. And there's a clear acknowledgement in the guidelines that the corridor definitions and the definition of how to invest using these sort of strategic corridor approaches makes sense. And based on that, it seemed like a smart move to try to articulate in the CFMP what these key investments would be in those key corridors that the Commission has already identified as sort of criteria for funding. So next slide. So one of the key statements in the guidelines themselves says right here that the Commission expects Caltrans to maintain and provide an updated prioritized freight project list prior to subsequent program cycles. So Commission staff has, and we've had a number of conversations with them, they would really like to have a section of the CFMP to be the guiding plan document and the content thereof, specifically laying out which projects to fund in the TCEP program. So in other words, if we're going to have a call for projects for TCEP, the Commission would really like to go to Chapter 8 of the CFMP and see a listing of projects that have been prioritized, and to the extent that you're asking for money and it's in the plan, you can get funded. That would be ideal, right? And what we've tried to articulate is when we try to do that, right, with the 1,200 project nominations, with applying criteria throughout the state to a diverse set of projects, we're not going to get there. I mean, we are being asked to do something and applying criteria to screw down on these lists of projects that may or may not have the right outcomes. And so with this in mind, though, that is the expectation of the Commission. So in trying to meet that expectation, the thought was, let's do it at a regional level. Let's do it at the corridor level, okay? So next slide. So as I mentioned in the guidelines are these 6 corridors: the Bay Area, Central Valley, Central Coast, Los Angeles Inland Empire, the San Diego border, and something called Other. And Other is not bad. It's just everywhere else in the state, not the other 5. So these are already in there. And for those of you specifically familiar with the guidelines, it actually talks about funding amounts. They're sort of percentages. And these go back to the TCEP days when TCIF was first developed. There's a lot of discussion about how those Prop 1B monies should be utilized throughout the state for the freight investments that were called for in that program. And there was a discussion about what would be fair, and those percentages were ultimately codified, and then those percentages were carried over into the TCEP program as well. And I think when we talked about this at the subcommittee, I think there was pretty much unanimity, one of those words, that those corridor designations make a lot of sense. They cover the key corridors in the state. And the percentages that have been carved out, while not guaranteed, they're not minimums, they're not maximums, they are a way for the Commission to organize the thought process on which projects maybe should be funded. And it represents the regional differences. It represents largely the urbanized areas where a lot of the freight is really key. And then to the extent that there is an opportunity for this other category, if there are key investments outside those regions, those can still be considered by the Commission. So with that in mind, we said, let's develop freight investment strategies for these 6 specific corridors. So next slide. So the idea really was tell your story. And so we reached out to essentially the leadership in those key corridors, and I think most of you are actually here, and we asked all of you to kind of develop what would be your story. Tell your story about your corridor. And it was relatively straightforward. Provide an overview of the existing and future conditions of that corridor. And recognizing the way those corridors are defined are kind of broad, right? When you go back to the previous slide real quick here, jump back, in the Bay Area, you're covering a bunch of counties. And so it's not easy to call that a corridor like the typical transportation corridor we might think of, because it's covering a whole bunch of counties. But I'm thinking of that more as a region, and within that region, you all have priorities. You have regional plans, you have freight action plans, you have priorities for funding through local measures. You know what you want to do, right? So here's your chance to tell your story through a freight lens to articulate that vision for that particular area. So the Bay Area puts together its story and says, what is most important to us in our corridor is, that's essentially what we're doing here. So next slide, provide in section 1 an overview of your region. What are you all about? What are you trying to accomplish? What's the vision for freight within that region? What regional policy and priorities do you have already in place that essentially implements the vision of what we're trying to do in the 2019 CFMP? And you guys have been along for the ride, so all of you know what that is. We've set some goals and we've set some priorities. We've talked about sustainable freight and a number of different issues. So you get to sort of articulate not only the high vision, but also how does that align with the state priorities. And then in the third section, we really wanted you not just to give us the 1,200 projects statewide, but what are the key projects within those 6 corridors? Okay? And pretty straightforward. We made that request. We asked you to submit that to us by late June, and we've been working through the details since then. So one of the things that has come up in this discussion is what kind of things should we be including? And we've emphasized a couple of times inclusion of sustainable freight projects. And why are we doing that? Because one of the things that we've been concerned about is that a lot of the focus has been on sort of large-scale, traditional state highway corridor expansion projects. And while those are perfectly legitimate to articulate, we also want to make sure that you capture some other things that maybe traditionally you wouldn't have included as a key priority. And we've done quite well in the state in pursuing some of these things. For example, we recently got a grant to do truck parking availability in the Interstate 10 corridor, and there's going to be some opportunities there. We've done a lot at the ports relative to knowing where to go, when to go to get your can, essentially, whether it's the GE Port Optimizer or the Freightus projects. We're working on border wait times to make sure that goes better. We also have GoPort. Hopefully, we're going to see that in the Port of Oakland. And so these are kind of the how to manage the system better kinds of projects that we also would like you to articulate in your strategy, so it's not just capacity increasing stuff only. And then next slide. So a number of submittals that we had back when we put the sustainable freight plan together, we had some really cool ideas. Cargo bite demonstration. There was some discussion about a marine highway that we continue to pursue. There was some discussion about zero-emission maglev, which may or may not have any feasibility. A lot of discussion about inland ports. That's still viable, and there may be some opportunities to make those very sustainable. And so we want to remind folks that we really want to move the needle in the CFMP. We don't want to just articulate traditional, standard sort of freight investments, but we also want to start identifying some cutting-edge, transformative projects that really move the needle on sustainability. And what we're talking about there, let's just be honest, is greenhouse gas emission reductions from the freight sector. That's what we're trying to accomplish. That's what the CFMP and the CSFAP articulated. Okay, so where are we then on the status of this whole thing? Thanks, Chris. Great background. What are you doing next? So we've got 5 of the 6 submitted, and the 6th one is a little tricky because SCAG is working on their RTP, and one of the things they've pointed out to us, it's a little difficult that if you're in the midst of an RTP, to at the same time also try to figure out your investment strategy when that investment strategy is really in flux at the regional level. And that's legit. And they, I think, having talked to Annie quite a bit about this, they understand that there's a need to put this together, and they need to do that in concert with their RTP development. So, we look forward to working on that further. But we've seen some specific challenges. One of the key challenges that we see is getting that regional consensus as to what should be included. That's kind of hard to do, right? So when push comes to shove and you got to put something in the plan, it's going to be in writing, it's going to be in a published document, it's going to be something that the Transportation Commission may use as guidance as to how to make their funding priority decisions. You really want to get that right? And the way folks have tried to get it right is let's put every project in the state into the document because that'll make it eligible. And now we're asking, well, let's be a little more specific. Let's be more strategic. Let's focus on a 5-year program. And let's not just put everything in there, but really put the stuff in there that's key and strategic that you think you want to get done in your region. And again, we want you to tell your story. Obviously, strategies vary in terms of specificity, basically reflective of the diversity of the corridors. Some corridors, to be honest, are pretty straightforward. Central coastal is a little more straightforward than the SCAG region. Let's just be honest about that. The quote-unquote other category all over the state is also not particularly straightforward because there's all sorts of niche locations where there's a need to maybe make an investment to benefit freight, but they're very disparate and they're spread out in the state, and they're very case-by-case based kind of needs that are sometimes a little hard to really articulate the overall value of that in a statewide plan. So we also need to do a little bit more to follow up with the strategies that have been developed. I think all of the ones that we've received have done a pretty good job articulating the overview of what the corridor is trying to do. Some have done a more robust job articulating very specifically the strategy in the corridor over the next 5 years and what the key investments are. And we are still a little challenged on specifically listing the projects. Some of you have got maybe slightly different understanding of what we're asking for. Some have done a really good job listing all of them. But we need to work with you to basically edit all this and make sure that the intent that you have really comes clearly through and that there's some consistency across the 6 of them, that one doesn't articulate things completely differently or is far more detailed than another. But we want to make sure that they're all clearly reflective of your intent. And then here's the biggest challenge at the end. Do we have one set of statewide priorities? Now, we've talked about this historically, especially at the federal level. If we pursue federal reauthorization priorities, or let's say we submit an infra grant package, or we submit a build grant package, could we all speak with one voice? That would be nice. Fran Inman is not here today, but I'm channeling her because at the national level, she's pointed this out repeatedly. It would be really, really good if we could do that. Now, I understand that's a huge challenge, and I'm not suggesting that the plan specifically lay out one set of priorities and let's literally say, these are the 5 things we want to do over here. Because that's really hard for all of us to come to some consensus on. And I'm not really sure that that's our job per se. But I think what we do need to do is say, these are the 6 corridors, and within these 6 corridors, we want to do these 30 things. I think we can do that. And let all of you, speak to your priorities, but then we also need to make sure we take a statewide perspective. Because what I don't think is valuable if it's all sort of balkanized, if you're just reflecting your own needs without some sensibilities how this whole thing syncs up, overall for statewide purposes. So next slide. So next steps, as I mentioned, we kind of need to take those 6 strategies, edit those a little bit, work with you, make sure that they're truly reflective of the intent. We want to package them into what's now going to be Chapter 8 of the draft CFMP. It would articulate very clearly what we're trying to do, what the background is, and why we're even writing the thing up the way we are. It would then have all 6 strategies specifically laid out, so each one would be easily digestible, readable, and hopefully would actually turn into a fact sheet for all of you, so you can pull out your strategy and hand it to somebody and say, this is my corridor, this is what we're trying to accomplish. And then as we apply the statewide lens to all these corridor strategies, are we missing anything? Are we completely overlooking anything? And are really the policy priorities that we want to set forward in the CFMP really reflective in those individual strategies? Because what we don't want is just 6 strategies that are sort of sitting there by themselves, but really not imbued with the sensibilities of the plan overall. And that's something that we're going to have to, quite frankly, try to articulate as one set of priorities with some input from our leadership, from the Secretary of Transportation, to really get some feedback on what it is they would like to see in the state plan. And, that's going to be a challenge. So what I'm hoping over the next month, because we do want to include these in the draft that Nieves talked about, that's going to go out at the end of July. Between now and the end of July, we've got to get that Chapter 8 to look pretty good so folks can start looking at it. And while that's still an internal review and making sure that folks at various state agencies are kind of weighing in on this, I want to make sure those 6 visions are clearly embedded in that document at that time. Is there opportunity to modify it? Sure. Is there opportunity to add things, drop things out? Absolutely. We also want to make sure that the effort to develop the larger list is not forgotten, because it's very important. All of you have tried to help us articulate that bigger set of needs. We want to make sure we are acknowledging that as well. So we plan to articulate a little bit of something about that in Chapter 8 and talk about what the broader needs are and perhaps the longer term needs. And then we'd append that list to the CFMP, perhaps as an appendix to be referred to. So there's really an inventory of these things that if somebody wants to know, is there a freight project in my future, go to that thing and you'll be able to go in there perhaps by county route, post mile, or facility type or something like that, and you could see a listing of that. So that's kind of where we are. And what I would like to do is invite some of the folks who've worked on those corridor strategies to talk a little bit about what your challenges are, how you like where we are at this point. Are you in agreement with these next steps? And then to the extent that some of the rest of you on the CFAC perhaps have not been involved but would like to weigh in, by all means, would love to get comments and issues, concerns, et cetera. And if you have any comments on the strategy I've laid out here, we'd love to hear that and have some discussion about that here. We have plenty of time before lunch. And like I said, I view the investment strategy, the Chapter 8 section of the CFMP, as really one of the most important sections. Like I said, folks are probably not going to read every word of the CFMP unless they're kind of, freight nerds like we all are. They're going to want to turn to where are these folks planning to spend the money? And they're going to go to Chapter 8 and they're going to look at that chapter and try to find their favorite project in their favorite part of the state, right? And that's what they're going to key in on. So I just want to make sure we get this right because it's so pivotal in terms of, the funding decisions that are going to come down the line.
Thank you, Chris.
Darwin.
Is this on? Can you hear me? Thanks, Chris, so much for that presentation. This is Darwin Musavi from the State Transportation Agency. Before we open it up for a discussion, I wanted to touch on your fourth next step that you mentioned there and provide some input. So we do have new leadership at CalSTA, and we've actually had a chance to brief the new Secretary Kim, on this process, and he's incredibly supportive of the process that Caltrans is taking to narrow down those priorities, and CalSTA, I think, is very much interested in making sure that the priorities that we do set forward are as consistent as they can be with the sustainable freight action plan, and I think that's going to be a big priority for the new secretary as one of his key goals to accomplish is to align the CFMP and the project list with the Sustainable Freight Action Plan as much as possible. I will say, commenting on your comment earlier about projects, traditional capacity expanding projects, I think it often gets difficult when we look at the 12 or so Sustainable Freight Action Plan bullet points and really start to think about, okay, what does that mean? How is that different from what we've been doing? Some of those things, like talk about truck travel time reliability being on there, for example, how is that not just additional capacity? And I think the key there is to really think about, key bottlenecks and projects that have a direct nexus to freight and telling the story. I think that's why the story is key, and prioritizing those over projects that frankly may have weaker connections to freight and our general capacity expanding projects that may have freight benefits but have less of a tie. I think there's a strong interest from CalSTA in prioritizing those specific freight projects. So with that, I'll let you open it up to comments.
So that's good to hear, directly from the Secretary office, and I hope you're all hearing that, because I think we are trying to articulate these visions, and we're hoping that you're helping us articulate that it's not Caltrans doing it as we write this plan, but it's reflective of what you want to do with these same sensibilities. So.
Good morning. Elisa Arias with the San Diego Association of Governments. Maybe echoing a bit the situation with SCAG. SANDA is also in the midst of updating a regional plan, and we have embarked in this bold new vision for the regional plan that is really having an emphasis, a finer point on greenhouse gas emissions. So we're at the point where we're drawing from our 2015 plan for our short-term project list. And these are, perfectly valid projects, but I could see, in a year or so having also new projects that would be interested in amending into the statewide plan, if that's a possibility.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. A number of regions are working on plan updates on various strategies. And, what are we capturing right now? We're going to capture things in the next 5 years and this current update to the CFMP. And you might have new stuff next year. So how do we capture that? It's our intent to be updating this plan every 5 years, but what do we do in between? And maybe there's a way to do that, to articulate some new sets of visions in these corridors as either an addendum or an update or something like that, to try to keep that a little bit more current, recognizing that, we're also charged with doing this in an open, public engaged kind of process so that folks can comment on that stuff. So we have to find maybe a way to update those investment strategies while also being clear that we need to make sure we get appropriate input from CFAC and from the general public as well.
And I was just going to ask, does anyone have a suggestion how that might play out? To Elisa's kind of comment, how would that actually look, and how could we actually do kind of that addendum, and how would that sort of line up with the regions when you guys are doing your updates to your RTPs and things like that? Because I think it would help us as we walk out of here today to figure out, okay, if there's a desire to add some sort of an addendum or an update process, how would that look to the Federal Highway Administration, to the regions? Give us some thoughts to that. That would be extremely helpful. All right, we got Michael. We got a taker.
Okay, well, I can touch on that a bit, a different set of questions, but to respond to you, I think, it's incumbent upon the local jurisdictions. Obviously, in the SCAG region, we have large RTPAs that are,
right.
But, I think the vetting of this at the public level, the public engagement level should be there, and then it should be probably just uploaded into the CFMP to keep it at a local level and also to ensure that there is some kind of consensus and vetting and approval of such a plan. I mean, Metro's doing its own long-range planning efforts. Everything syncs up with the SCAG efforts. I mean, there is an opportunity there. I think if we're talking about RTPs being updated, they're on a schedule.
Right.
So I think you can have that kind of consistency just built into the CFMP, and especially if it's separated as an addendum as opposed to a chapter you have to rewrite every 2 years or whatever. So on that, on the CFMP in general, bless you. On CFMP in general, I have two things. One, and practically speaking, I don't see how the CFMP and this concept, which we're trying to do, can inform the TSUP guidelines that we're going to be adopting this year. I just don't see it. I think it's a stretch to say that the TSUP guidelines are going to all of a sudden change dramatically to include this larger vision of how the CFMP is the underlying foundation for that. I think the next cycle probably is a better place, so I don't know what my colleagues would say to that, but just practically speaking, I don't think we're going to be able to have any radical changes to TSUP for this cycle, given what we want to do with the schedule, the delay, and also this new the corridor approach. So
and I appreciate that, Michael, that the statement that I had up earlier is really what was in the guidelines as written today, that the Commission staff and the Commission would like to rely upon the CFMP as the guiding document to make funding decisions. And I think that's just good planning, right? You do plans, you develop investment strategies, and then hopefully when you make funding decisions, you're relying upon those rather than just sort of making things up out of thin air. I don't necessarily disagree in terms of the timing, because what we're talking about in terms of the guideline update and the call for projects later this fall and awards in early 2020, that may not elegantly line up with the TSUP timing. But I do think that when the Commission staff have to review projects and the commissioners have to consider making funding decisions, I think seeing these strategies clearly articulated, where the projects, the way they're often, quite frankly, submitted to the Commission, it looks like a spot project somewhere where I need, $100 million to fix 5760, and it looks like some sort of major interchange investment. That's not the half of it, right? It is really a part of a much bigger strategy to solve a major bottleneck that's really a main inland empire connection. And perhaps these investment strategies that are embedded in this plan could help articulate some of that a little bit more clearly. So while you're asking for money for a particular investment, it's really part of this much bigger investment strategy for that particular corridor. And I think that's kind of where we'd like to go. And while the CFMP may not be updated and adopted by that time, I think those strategies can be circulating, and folks could be benefited by understanding what that strategy is and how that might influence a particular funding decision. That's my thought, but that's just me, and I certainly appreciate where you're coming from on that.
Let's see, we've got Elisa and then Annie. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, let's go with Annie. You had the mic. I didn't see you had it already, so sorry.
It's okay. I just wanted to respond to your prior question, Coco, with respect to the timing of the various RTPs and the CFMP. I guess, fortunately for us at SCAG, our RTP cycle seems to be relatively in line with the CFMP this time around. It creates a lot of work currently, but it allows for at least seamless input into the CFMP process, having made sure that we're actually then coordinating with our regional partners on the RTP as well. So having said that, I think throughout the state we have varying processes with respect to the RTP, varying cycles. Right. And I'm not sure if other MPOs do this, but SCAG most definitely, we do have amendment processes for our RTP on a rather frequent basis. And I think it's just the nature of how large our region is. I don't know to what extent some of the other MPOs actually have formalized amendments, but I do think it may be important going forward, because of our amendments and because of the different cycles, to allow for interim updates to the CFMP.
Great, thank you.
And just sort of thinking about just how to do that, because I do agree when a plan is updated to the extent that what you're trying to accomplish in a corridor is really clearly articulated in that RTP update, that there could be a clear linkage there, that it's not something else that you're submitting to be included in the CFMP, but it's really a component of what you're saying in your RTP, which has gone through public approval processes and that sort of thing, so that we're not just sort of slipping one in there, that kind of thing. It's on. It's
Okay,
speech activated.
Similarly, maybe it's a request from the MPO, to this group to start the process, and maybe it's an annual update, so you can combine, more than one request as an addendum, amendment or addendum.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific idea. Just big picture wise, we're trying to really get your story into the plan. In many states throughout the nation, the Department of Transportation simply writes this plan and puts stuff in there. That's not California, right? We're trying to be inclusive. We're trying to really make sure that the regional priorities are clearly reflected. And so, we got to figure out how to do enough of that, but occasionally you kind of have to have a plan that's finished as well, right? Especially when we submit to FHWA and we articulate those things, we got to make sure this is actually our plan. And we're not asking for the feds to update or review an update or approve an update. We can get into all the details of that, but I think we do want to make sure that there's some flexibility, so we can talk about that a little bit, because we don't want to be asserting that authority over everyone else.
Kenneth.
Thank you. Kenneth Cow, MTC. I think I just had 3 points that I wanted to make. Number one, kind of to Michael's point, I think I've always said this, I don't want this CFMP to really be the basis for any type of funding splits, because I think that really complicates how we think about these projects. And I think that's something that we're going to work with CTC on when they develop the next round of TCEP guidelines. I know you had that expectation in there from last time, but that was from last time. So I'm hopeful that for cycle 2 of TCEP, we can kind of change that a little bit to make it kind of make a little bit more sense with our planning processes.
Let me maybe just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
So, I'm certainly not here to say what the funding splits should be or percentages or anything like that. When we started talking about how to create some project priorities, what made elegant sense is to focus on those corridors, right, and preserve sort of the structure of how to make the funding decision based on the corridors. What the numbers should be, okay, that's a separate conversation, and I agree with you. I think that's a conversation worth having as part of the guideline update. Because there are some pros and cons of how to do that, and the way it's currently written, I think I sort of like the general language that there are some funding targets. They're not minimums, they're not maximums, they're not guarantees. So that gives a lot of flexibility. But you all would, I think, like to have some certainty occasionally, like, every few years there's going to be a funding cycle. My region is probably going to get a certain percentage of that funding, so I can get mentally ready to align my project delivery process in anticipation of trying to capture that. And I think that level of certainty is super important to try to make projects go. And I think that conversation, I think, needs to be had during the guideline development. And we are hoping that the CFMP can at least be a place where you can point to say, well, this is kind of where the projects are, right? We're not just making this stuff up as we go.
Right. I think some of the challenges that we continue to face is just kind of getting projects from some of our non-traditional partners. So those are things like some of the smaller seaports. I mean, Port of Oakland's here, but some of the smaller seaports, some of our airports, which we don't really work with all the time very closely, and sometimes even like the air district. So they might be thinking of some stuff that we've been asking them to let us know so that we can include it in the CFMP, but sometimes that doesn't get there. So I think that leads to my third point of what you've and Coco are discussing is like to have that flexibility to have maybe annual addendums to accommodate some of these things that maybe we at the MPO level may not be not knowledgeable about, but then that's something that has come up since then. That definitely is an important piece of the puzzle. And again, I think for timing it with the RTP, maybe an annual update might make sense because, our update I think is in 2021 for the RTP, and so that's like in the middle of when this plan is valid for. So having that process is really helpful.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the notion that, to the extent that you're leveraging your RTP process to try to identify these other non-traditional type of projects, I think we want to encourage that. And, Darwin just mentioned that if that becomes a stronger focus from the state, then we need to give you an opportunity to actually go through the sort of the project planning work to try to identify those and work with partners to try to identify and figure out how to deliver those and maybe when could those things happen and with what funding stream could those be done. So really think that makes a lot of sense. What else? Let me just reiterate, Michael.
Yeah, sorry, just a quick question. On the, we're concerned at Metro on some of our mega projects that are probably multiple cycles. We're having difficulty trying to get a project like the 710 South repackaged into a 3-year cycle for TSIP, where if we ask for what we need, we probably could take the entire amount. So, but if we try to go cycle by cycle, it becomes difficult trying to align the project and the needs we have with the funding opportunities, especially not just the state, but also going for infra or whatever the successor is. So is the CFMP and the corridor strategy going to allow for those kinds of projects that are just abnormally large and require multiple years of funding commitments, or at least a concept of how do we do it over multiple cycles of TSIP?
Yeah, I think there's really a great opportunity in Chapter 8 to try to articulate that. So, on the one hand, we're asking you to sort of focus on 5 years and telling us sort of the near-term stuff, but we don't want to forget in Chapter 8 to tell the bigger story, that we really are talking about a long-range need to invest, and that there are going to be specific projects and corridors where, like you said, there's not going to be a single tranche of investment that can accomplish that. Some of these projects literally, take decades to deliver, not only just from a funding availability, but even if the funds were there, you just really can't construct this stuff that quickly. So I think we can, in Chapter 8, sort of explain that a little bit to sort of say, well, you have to take a sort of a near-term strategic investment approach, but you also have to have a longer-term approach where you're really looking out those 20 or 30 years like the RTPs do, so you're not losing sight of that. And I think what Chapter 8 can help do is really articulate the unmet need for freight investment. Really let's not only talk about what we can do right now in the next 5 years, but let's talk about that bigger story. What is the need for that investment over the long term? So one of the things we could be working on with you is really asking you to tell us, well, what do you need over 20, 30 years, so that there's a sort of a look ahead as well for each of these corridors. That we're not just saying it's 5 years only and that's all we're interested in, but let's put some numbers to it over the next 20, 30 years, which is probably more reflective of really what the RTPs are trying to articulate as well. So definitely could do that.
So you've got Carrie here in the front.
Just a quick question. I think, Chris, in the earlier time period of the investment strategy development and the subcommittee meetings and the solicitation of projects we had, first 5 years, I think 5 to 10 and beyond that, I assume that's still going to be maintained in Chapter 8 and or appendices?
Yeah, so what Carrie was referring to, when we had that call for projects, we really had the longer term identified in there, and that's why we had the 1,200 projects. So, there's two things in there. One that makes the list really long is because you've got a very long time frame, so you wind up with a lot more projects. The other reason that the list was very long is we had projects in there that might not have fit that freight definition really super well. Okay, so yes, we would carry those forward so that they're at least in there. So again, to the point of, things take longer, there's reference somewhere in the document that really says, look, there is a mega project called 710, and there's like 8 phases to this thing, right? And we could actually put that in the plan that way so it's clearly articulated. And we've had that discussion a number of times with folks. When you get into project planning stuff, it's super hard to articulate the broader need of a corridor that may be really, really large and a particular funding request for a particular phase of work that you're doing right now, without losing sight of the fact that you're really trying to invest in the total corridor, because otherwise that one investment doesn't really pay off unless you do all the other stuff, right? It's the pearls on the string that make the necklace. So what else? Got a question in the back?
Hello, this is Nathan Dean with the Air Resources Board, and I wanted to make a comment. It sounds like this plan is very focused on TSAP and federal funding, but I just kind of wanted to highlight that other state agencies like the Air Resources Board also has a lot of funding available for these types of projects. We have a lot of freight-focused GHG reduction sort of programs and funding available, and I think that this could be a very good tool, not just for TSAP, but also for state agencies who want to fund these types of projects. And maybe coordinating and figuring out, if you can get funding from other sort of places other than TSAP, I could see this as a very helpful tool.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the plan will try to articulate what some of those fund sources are, because to your point, there are a number of, especially sort of the clean freight type of to dollars, clean energy type of investments. And what we don't want to confuse is that from an eligibility perspective, having those to be in the CFMP to be eligible, that's not where we're going, but to sort of highlight that there are opportunities for these other funds out there and being strategic about how to pursue those. And to be perfectly honest, the state needs to kind of articulate that a little bit better to some of our regional partners who struggle with, there are all these fund sources, what am I pursuing and how do these all align with each other, so that I can really kind of cobble together a package to deliver some of these things. So, yeah, that'll be a challenge to all of us.
I'm also speaking at one about some of our funding opportunities, so hopefully I'll help with that.
Great.
Good.
What else?
Frank, we got Frank over here.
Hi, Chris. Frank Ramirez, Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. As you know, the economic competitiveness is near and dear to my heart. We've had plenty of discussions on that. And the draft has a chapter on that, and it goes into some detail. How does that translate into the project list, and how do we address that issue through the process you just discussed?
Yeah, and so that's that last line there, try to articulate one set of priorities. I think we need to figure out how to do that. This is one of the little tricky things that when we talk about these different priorities, what Frank's referring to is that key issue of economic freight competitiveness that we embedded in the CSFAP when we articulated that. Competitiveness today is not spelled out specifically in the TSEP guidelines from a funding prioritization perspective, so that hasn't been a focus. But we can make that a focus within the CFMP to talk about what do we mean by competitiveness, and then that opens up that whole other can of worms, right? So there's a very robust discussion that you heard about at the last CFAC meeting about competitiveness, how to define that, how to make the sector more successful within the state, the cost of doing business, the economic opportunities that exist in California versus other parts of the state and other parts of the world, and then how do specific investments make us more economically competitive overall. We'll have to talk about that, and I don't know that we can necessarily, within the articulation of the projects themselves and in Chapter 8, spell that out sort of overtly to say this project has this economic competitiveness benefit, but I think we could try to better articulate what we mean by economic competitiveness like we do in the document, and maybe reference back to that in the chapter to sort of try to make that linkage to which investments get us there, and hopefully all of them give us some competitiveness advantage, but some may do that better than others. So it comes back to how to measure it and how to apply it to a specific project. So I think that's going to be a challenge. So as you guys all are thinking about that and reviewing the draft when we circulate that, that's maybe something to take into consideration, and we should definitely work on that a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Second, a related question is in terms of priorities. For example, the governor has as one of his top priorities is the regions rising together focus, where you have those regions that have been left behind in terms of the economic growth historically in California. He'd like to see more activity generating jobs and economic development in those areas. How does a vision and a priority like that get into a project list as well?
Yeah, I think that's another good one, because I think that's another difficult one to articulate. So on the one hand, I think the state has focused on disadvantaged communities, folks that have been left behind, focused more on disproportional impacts to those communities from pollution and other stressors. So there's some sensitivity about that. But when you flip that a little bit to your point, to actually say where should public investments go to really help more disadvantaged communities from an economic development perspective, how do we talk about that? And, I think, again, the corridor write-ups could also help a little bit with that. How do the various investments that you're trying to make, generate that economic opportunity for all the people in your region, and hopefully maybe some focus on the most disadvantaged in those communities. So, again, I think we could, to the extent I have that little lens up there, I think that's a good lens to think about. How do we create economic opportunity? How do we make sure we protect equity? Those are the kinds of things that are hard, and ultimately that can get also codified in the funding guidelines, where there's some clear, criteria for how you might evaluate that for funding eligibility. So.
And then just real quick, maybe before we go to Carrie, sort of on Frank's point, I think, the Freight Mobility Plan, the CFMP, is and should be both a regional and a statewide plan, right? So it's really a statewide plan. So from a state perspective, we want to see, kind of how those regional priorities, however it is that we end up displaying them or talking about them in the CFMP, are actually collectively getting us to where the state goals are as well. And then what are the gaps in order that we collectively need to sort of work towards making sure that we're filling those gaps, and then having conversations regarding that. So, ideally, that's kind of the whole bigger picture of the CFMP, and it would have to address, our governor's priorities, such as the one that you just mentioned, Frank. So we'll move over to Carrie real quick.
Simple request, which may not be that simple. I'd like Caltrans to consider having maybe a special CFAC meeting in August for agencies of the corridors, not just the MPOs, but other agencies, to provide input. And it's just input, to help out in the prioritization of the projects for the first 5 years. I think I saw a number of, was it 161 or something like that? Wasn't that high for a number of projects, so maybe it might be useful to provide some input on prioritization.
Yeah. So a couple of things. One, I think we're not so much focused on the prioritization anymore that I articulated we tried to do during the first and second iteration of developing sort of a project list. I think what I'm trying to articulate here is we're trying to get away from that a little bit to not so much talk about priorities, but really articulating those key needs within each of the corridors. So it's sort of self-prioritized by the corridors. So can you flip back to the corridors just to help out a little bit? Because I think on the one hand, I'm here from the state, or I'm from the state, I'm here to help you. You're familiar with that? I'm also here from the state, and I want you to help yourselves. So in the Los Angeles Inland Empire area, those counties should have an easy time getting together, talking about these things, and putting together a single strategy that can go into the plan. Yeah, that's not going to be that easy, right? So I get that. And I think, Annie and I had this discussion. She called me at like some crazy time in the morning to say, hey, we're not ready. And I think that's reflective of regional governance and how difficult it is to make these sort of determinations. But I think we can certainly be the facilitator of these conversations, and we're going to be following up with Rob in particular in the Central Valley, because that is a mega corridor in terms of just the geography, running, Bakersfield to Sacramento or beyond. That's rather large, and trying to get everything in one strategy is a little bit hard. And it's actually a fairly diverse corridor. Let's not kid ourselves, right? It is certainly not a single corridor, but as defined, it obviously has a lot of diversity. So if you would like us to, we can help, or we can stay out of it. And you all could organize your own conversations amongst yourselves, recognizing that this is what the intent is, that we articulate these corridor strategies based on the definition that's up here. You all get together and have that conversation amongst yourself. If you would like Caltrans to be the convener, I think we can do that. But we don't want to be there to tell you, quote unquote, what to do. And I'm not sure you all need to do that. You guys all know who you are. I know you know each other. So, and if Colmay were here, he'd say other things, so I'm not going to do that. But fundamentally, you guys can get together and have that conversation. I think we're going to help Rob in particular because he's been very helpful in helping us shape the Central Valley one because of the diversity of the entities that are involved, so that Caltrans will act as the convener. But if you guys want us to do that for the Los Angeles Inland Empire or for any of the others, we're happy to do that. So if that's a desire, I'd be deferential to all of you in the region, but no problem setting up a meeting.
I was just going to say, I actually heard the question maybe a little bit different. So I think what I heard Carrie suggest is, would it, because based on the timeline, the draft is going to be ready in early September or end of July, early September. And then it's going to go pretty quickly through CFAC early September. So Carrie's request, I believe, was to have a special meeting, a meeting in between to focus just on this particular topic, not necessarily with just one of the regions, but all of the regions. Was that correct?
For the one statewide kind of thing, and making sure your corridor vision is good and sound, and
well, not the corridor vision, but just to provide some helpful input on priorities, knowing that, as you said earlier, the CTC would like to see, obviously first tranche of projects, and if you can come to some sort of consensus, quasi-consensus on more than just the project listing, so be it. If you don't, so be it as well.
Yeah. I mean, is that generally something you all in favor of? Would that be helpful? I understand where Carrie's coming from on this, and more than happy to do that. And what I don't want to do is create an opportunity for Carrie to position as port projects, and the rest of you get screwed. No, but I mean, we understand, but we can certainly do that, because I think once you see all the strategies together and sort of see kind of where we're going, that might be valuable and might make the review and adoption of the plan a lot easier.
Rob Ball from KernCog, and Chris, I want to thank you for putting what you've put together so far. In the San Joaquin Valley, we are still kind of getting the narrative out to all the MPOs up the valley, and so the little team of us that have put together that narrative, it's still probably in flux. But I did want the committee to be aware that we're considering adopting the Eastern Sierra side as a part of the San Joaquin Valley corridor. There's some key network features up in the mountains for rail and for highways that just make a lot of sense in terms of gateways. We're not just a valley, but we're a valley with connecting gateways. So I just wanted to make the committee aware of that.
And it's been tried before. The water you may or may not be drinking came from the Eastern Sierra as well. When we set that up, do you want us to help you with that? Because we can definitely pull those folks into that conversation. And okay, great. So what else? Anything else on this? Because we want to make sure that we get this part right. It is really super important on a number of different levels. As you heard Darwin say, this is something that the Secretary is going to be focused on, and I think we're going to get a lot of input from the new Secretary. Keeping in mind that David Kim is from the Federal Highway Administration from Washington. I think he has a pretty good understanding about how federal funds work, so there's going to be a keen interest in that and positioning the state to make sure that we're at the table and that we are successful. So we want to make sure that this chapter really does a robust job of articulating that. So anything else, any other concerns? Like we said, we're going to have this draft out where you get a chance to review, obviously, the entire document with an emphasis definitely on this chapter, because we want to make sure we get this part right, given all the different contributions that we've had. So with that, thank you. And by all means, if you have any questions, concerns, do contact me so that we can work with you to facilitate all of that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Chris. So with that, it is lunchtime, everyone. So you get a few minutes extra. So we're scheduled to be back at 1 o'clock for lunch. And there's a list of recommended restaurants that are available. I believe it's in your packets. There's a couple within short proximity to this Caltrans building. So you have an hour and a few minutes to get lunch and come back at 1 o'clock, because we still have quite a number of very interesting topics that we want to continue to talk about. So thank you very much. See you at 1 o'clock.